The growth of Muslim community institutions changed everyday life in the Ebro Valley, yet the borders between Muslim and Christian society were rarely clean in practice. Money and law mattered, but identity was built from more than courts and taxes. Work, trade, and the networks people relied on each day also shaped who they were. In this region, the economy became one of the strongest forces pulling communities together, especially because Muslims were active in many different kinds of work. Most were not tied down as captives or serfs. They could move, buy and sell, and manage their property with relatively few limits. Over the 12th and 13th centuries, there is no clear, steady trend showing a broad collapse of these freedoms. Because Muslims were numerous and legally free in many places, their labour and business naturally connected them to the wider society of the Crown, both as individuals and as a group. Participation in Christian-run markets also nudged Muslims toward Western styles of contracts, credit and exchange. At the same time, older ways of farming and production did not simply vanish. The sheer size of the Muslim population helped preserve techniques and routines that had existed before conquest. This produced a constant push and pull, integration through markets and institutions on one side, continuity through demographic strength and local habit on the other. We see this tension most clearly in agriculture, the backbone of the medieval economy, where older share-based farming arrangements gradually reshaped into new forms that fit Christian legal language and Christian property regimes, while irrigation knowledge, animal raising and other practical skills continued largely because they worked and because so many people depended on them. Most people farmed, and Muslims appear in the record in many roles: owners of land, renters, share-based cultivators, and sometimes a mix of all three at once. Some writers have claimed Muslims were essentially all tenants, but the evidence does not support such a simple picture. We find Muslims holding land in ways that look like real ownership, and we also find frequent buying, selling, swapping, and gifting of plots, not merely use rights. Even when the legal line between ownership and tenancy can be blurry in medieval documents, Muslims often had strong practical control over land. Their ability to trade property and the volume of land transactions involving Muslims, Jews and Christians points to a population with capital, initiative and room to maneuver. It also shows why Muslims were able to expand their holdings by purchasing land from Christian sellers, a pattern that suggests both economic strength and a labour supply large enough to work new fields when Christian settlement was still thin in some areas. One striking feature of the countryside is how often economic partnerships crossed religious lines. In different places and different decades, Muslims and Christians sometimes held land together or worked land under the same lord in shared arrangements. The records do not always explain how these partnerships began. They may have grown out of joint ventures, family shares that changed hands, debt seizures, or confiscations that split earlier holdings. However they formed, these mixed arrangements pulled Muslims further into Christian administrative routines and encouraged practical solidarity between partners who depended on the same harvest and faced the same risks. Share-based cultivation became especially common after conquest because it suited both sides. For many Muslims, working land on a crop share could be more attractive than buying land from Christians because land purchases could trigger additional obligations tied to church dues alongside community payments. For churches and monasteries, crop share agreements offered a way to keep land productive without selling it, and selling could be complicated by rules surrounding donated property. Even lay landowners found share-based agreements useful, and some exploited them to reduce what they owed to the church. In effect, an economic arrangement that looked simple on the ground could serve very different strategies depending on who held the title and who did the labour. Because Muslim share-based cultivators were so visible, later observers sometimes treated the term for this role as if it meant Muslim tenant in general. That misunderstanding has carried into some modern writing, where the label has been mistaken for a rigid social class or a legal status, but the better reading is that it describes a contract type, not a kind of person. These were tenants whose rent was paid as a portion of the crop, while the title holder carried the wider burdens attached to the land. Those wider burdens might include dues to the crown or the church, depending on the property. The share tenant still faced other obligations not connected to that specific plot. In other words, the arrangement was a business relationship shaped by negotiation, and it thrived after conquest because it fit the needs of both conquerors and conquered. These agreements were often written down in detail. They spelled out the duties of each side, and they could include extra services, hospitality expectations, or labour requirements. They also usually included penalties for breaking the contract early, which tells us something important. This was not automatically a condition of bondage. Many contracts were time-limited, running for a set number of years, though some were renewed or replaced by new agreements. Inheritance was not guaranteed, but sometimes it was negotiated into the deal, especially when a family had long farmed the same land and wanted stability. The share owed to the owner could vary widely. Irrigation, tools, animals, seed, and the state of the local labour market all affected the bargaining. In many districts, the labour market often gave Muslim cultivators real leverage, especially when landowners needed experienced workers who knew irrigation systems and local routines. Once such a contract existed, the tenant's stake in the land was recognised in practice. That is why tenants sometimes appear as named parties when land was sold, exchanged, or transferred. If land changed hands, the new holder often had to acknowledge the tenant's rights for the duration of the agreement. In some cases, tenants even sought translated copies of charters so they could defend their position, showing a clear awareness of the legal environment and the need for documentary proof. In other cases, buyers received land but could not fully control it until the tenant's term ended, or until the tenant died, with the buyer limited to collecting a portion of the harvest in the meantime. That kind of detail makes it hard to argue that these tenants were simply treated as property. It is true that a few documents sound as if a share tenant was being given to someone, but those cases are better explained by the individual's separate status as an enslaved person or household dependent, not by the farming contract itself. In some instances, a single person could be both a dependent in one sense and a share tenant in another, which shows that the contract type did not automatically define legal freedom or unfreedom. More broadly, the evidence points strongly towards share tenants being legally free, bound by the written terms they accepted, not by a permanent condition of servitude. This becomes even clearer when the same individual appears running multiple arrangements at once, selling personal property unrelated to the tenancy, or holding different kinds of land under different rules. Documents also distinguish crop share tenants from other kinds of rural dependents. Some Muslim villages are described in ways that tie them to rent-based tribute, or to ordinary vassal-like obligations under a lord, without the language of crop share tenancy. In those cases, the terms are spelled out as fixed payments of grain or other dues. When texts explicitly list both crop share tenants and other Muslims side by side, it strongly suggests the label refers to a specific arrangement rather than a universal Muslim condition. Muslim landowners also employed Muslim share tenants, and Christian landowners sometimes entered similar share agreements as well. But the label used for Muslim tenants was not always applied to Christians, even when the practical terms were comparable. That difference matters because it shows how religious identity influenced vocabulary, even when economic behaviour overlapped. In some institutional settings, Christian officials took crop share deals on the same terms that Muslim tenants had enjoyed, then hired labour to do the work. This underlines a basic point. The system was flexible, and people moved within it strategically. Another feature of the post-conquest economy was how exemptions and immunities could distort the picture. Tenants working land owned by privileged institutions sometimes gained partial protection from certain taxes tied to production. Those privileges could be narrow and specific, but many tenants tried to stretch them into broader personal immunity. Powerful landlords often supported these claims because it benefited their estates. This produced long conflicts between Muslim community authorities and these tenants, with courts and officials dragged in repeatedly. The result was not only legal friction, but also new alliances, where Muslims might find themselves backed by major Christian institutions against other Muslims, and where practical interest outweighed religious solidarity. When we step back, the larger pattern is clear. Agriculture in the Ebro Valley shows both continuity and transformation at once. Older share-based farming practices did not disappear. They adapted to a new political and legal order, translated into new administrative language, and survived because they were economically useful. At the same time, the conquest reshaped the rules around ownership, taxation, church dues, and documentation, and these pressures pushed Muslims and Christians into shared markets, shared contracts, and shared disputes. The countryside became a place where identity was negotiated through work, through who owned the land, who laboured on it, how the harvest was divided, and which authority, community, church, lord or crown, claimed a share of what the soil produced. The spread of share-based farming contracts in the Crown of Aragon shows how institutions can travel, survive, and change shape without losing their core logic. What began as a familiar Islamic-style partnership for working land was gradually reshaped inside a Christian political order. These agreements were not only about growing crops, they tied Muslim labour and expertise to Christian landlords, monasteries and towns in ways that made everyday interests overlap. In that sense, the system helped people cooperate because harvests, water access, tools, and profits depended on keeping the arrangement stable. Yet the same system also pulled Muslim communities into Christian routines of paperwork, fees, and outside oversight. Over time, this could weaken internal cohesion, especially when questions of tax privilege arose. Once some tenants gained partial immunity through the status of their landlords, and others did not, resentment and division became easier to ignite. As fields became better known and yields more predictable, some long-running crop share arrangements could even start to look like ordinary fixed rent, because an expected portion of the harvest could be converted into a stable payment in grain, money, or both. By the late 13th century, some dues were already being expressed in standardised amounts rather than as a percentage of produce. Meanwhile, the label attached to these share-based tenants spread beyond its original meaning, and because Muslim farmers used the arrangement so widely, everyday speech increasingly treated the word as if it simply meant a Muslim tenant, even when that was not accurate. Water management created another powerful thread of continuity. Irrigation networks often survived the change of regime, and they did more than keep fields green. They kept communities interdependent. Managing canals, dams, and water turns forced cooperation, created shared routines, and preserved older local authority structures because people who understood the system controlled its practical operation. In some parts of the Ebro watershed, the surviving evidence is thin, but where we can see clearly, the pattern suggests that older irrigation landscapes remained recognisable long after conquest. In a few places, major infrastructure had older foundations, sometimes even dating back to Roman engineering, yet it was under Islamic rule that many systems expanded and became tightly linked to nearby settlements. After Christian settlement advanced, these networks often continued to be run much as before, not because conquerors were trying to preserve Islamic life, but because disrupting water arrangements was the fastest way to destroy productivity. Estates and irrigation units frequently stayed intact as working packages, and even when ownership shifted, the internal structure of fields, canals, and water rights often remained. That stability is visible in the way properties continued to be identified by the names of earlier Muslim owners long after the transfer. When a complex estate kept its shape even though its holdings were scattered across a landscape, it strongly suggests the surrounding mosaic of land tenure also changed more slowly than conquest narratives sometimes imply. In regions that remained mostly Muslim for generations, the direction of adaptation often ran the opposite way from what we might expect. Newcomers were drawn into existing Muslim production systems, rather than Muslims being forced to abandon them overnight. In districts where large monasteries became major landlords, Christians and Muslims could find themselves sharing elaborate irrigation schedules rooted in older customs. The new owner's priorities were straightforward: keep the land producing. That usually meant letting experienced local farmers keep doing what worked, especially in irrigation, where small changes could trigger conflict or collapse. Lords sometimes investigated canals and water rules simply to understand what they had inherited. But in practice, control tended to stay with the producers because they had the knowledge to run the system day to day. This expertise could give Muslim communities informal bargaining power. When a canal or water right was transferred between Christian parties, the appearance of Muslim witnesses in the transaction can signal exactly that reality. They were present not as symbolic participants, but because they understood the system's workings better than anyone else, and their knowledge could prevent future disputes. Christians did build new canals in some areas, so irrigation knowledge was not exclusive, but older networks were not abandoned, which kept Muslim expertise relevant for generations. In some cases, Muslims were even explicitly granted the right to irrigate using the same techniques that had been customary before, and officials were warned not to interfere. Shared irrigation also forced accommodation in mixed settlements. When neighbouring communities negotiated water use or built new diversion works, agreements could involve military orders, town councils, rural workers, and tenants of different faiths, all committing themselves to the same schedule and the same rules. These were practical pacts. Water could not be divided along confessional lines without wrecking the system, so the infrastructure itself pushed people into cooperation. The same logic applied to the wider economy. Crop choices show strong continuity where irrigation remained stable, even as producers responded to shifting markets after conquest. Documents tend to highlight cereals because they were central to dues and rents, but vineyards and market gardens also mattered, and many holdings appear as mixed packages of different land types. That kind of diversification suggests farmers were still spreading risk and making the most of local water and soil. Animal husbandry also remained important, though the sources rarely describe technique in detail. We do see enough to know that long-distance seasonal herding continued, and that Muslims participated fully, sometimes sending flocks across long routes, and sometimes hiring Christian shepherds, just as Muslims could work as herders for Christian owners. Movement across borders and changing frontiers shaped taxation and regulation, but herding traditions did not suddenly stop when political control shifted southward. Grazing disputes appear too, including complaints about outsiders bringing herds onto local pasture and efforts to defend community rights. Theft cases and seizures of livestock also show that many Muslim households invested in animals, sometimes on a large scale. Goats, sheep, and other stock appear repeatedly, and a few references hint at substantial herds owned by individual Muslim producers. At the same time, the broader medieval tension between mobile herding and settled farming involved Christians and Muslims on both sides. Privileges granted to herdsmen could undermine intensive gardening and irrigated plots, yet seasonal grazing had deep roots in the region and continued to shape rural life. Beyond farming, Muslims also worked in many trades: tailors, carpenters, shoemakers, metalworkers, dyers, soap makers, physicians, butchers, and others appear in the record. These roles did not form a separate social world from agriculture. Many people combined craft work with farming, and wealth did not map neatly onto occupation. There were prosperous farmers and struggling artisans, and the reverse. Still, the survival of skilled trades and small industries suggests that conquest did not erase a local middle layer of economic life. Workshops and service businesses gave Muslim communities places to circulate money, maintain social ties, and keep familiar styles of production alive. Shops connected to food production, ovens, or neighbourhood services could function as everyday meeting points in mixed towns, where economic necessity often mattered more than religious separation. Some trades carried a direct religious dimension, especially the preparation and sale of meat. The ability to slaughter according to Muslim rules was part of religious liberty, but in practice it also became an administrative and fiscal matter. Authorities increasingly treated such services as licensed privileges that could be sold, rented or controlled, generating steady revenue. The result could look like a monopoly, not necessarily tied to a single building, but tied to the right to provide the service and collect fees. Because meat sales produced income, officials sometimes tried to seize control, replace Muslim supervisors, or redirect profits. When this happened, disputes were not only about doctrine, they were about who controlled a lucrative stream of revenue. At the same time, ordinary consumers did not always obey the strict lines that leaders preferred. When Muslims bought meat from other minority vendors, local authorities sometimes attempted bans, whether out of religious concern, fear of blurred boundaries, or simple financial loss. Higher royal power could step in to overturn local rules, treating them as unauthorized innovations or as disruptive to order and commerce. Similar licensing and monopolies appear in other services too, showing a wider pattern. As the economy integrated into the structures of the crown, everyday work, markets, and necessities increasingly passed through layers of privilege, oversight, and revenue extraction, even when the actual labour remained in the hands of the same local people. Under Christian rule, the Muslim communities of the Ebro region often found their strongest economic openings in two areas: high-value crafts and the building trades. Construction mattered especially, because churches, public works, and noble projects created steady demand for skilled brickwork, metalwork, carpentry, and engineering. Even though much of the surviving Mudajar-style architecture is later, a great deal of building was already happening in the 13th century, and Muslim craftsmen were deeply involved in it. In major cities, we can trace Muslim workers attached to specific church projects and urban construction long before the 14th century boom. For many artisans, this work did more than pay well. It offered safety, status, and sometimes special protection, because kings and nobles and leading institutions needed reliable specialists. In moments of crisis, skilled labour could literally preserve a family's freedom. After major upheavals, rulers sometimes spared or relocated craftsmen because workshops and technical knowledge were too valuable to lose. Tailors, metalworkers, weapon specialists and builders could be singled out for favour, simply because a royal court or a major city depended on their hands. Royal patronage could be practical and direct. A craftsman who entered royal service might be provided with a shop space, tools, and the ability to operate under official protection. Others were rewarded with broad tax relief for themselves and their households, in exchange for performing a specialised task on demand, such as producing high-quality clothing or maintaining a service the court wanted close at hand. What stands out is how these careers could intersect with local authority. A skilled builder or engineer might also hold an important communal office back home, returning from a major project to resume leadership duties, handle legal disputes, and defend community rights against outside interference. In a world where offices increasingly required money to obtain and promised income once secured, successful artisans were often well positioned to buy influence. Favour from above could also extend to cleaning up debts or unpaid bills left behind during royal assignments, a sign that certain individuals were considered too useful to allow their reputation or finances to collapse. Work opportunities also moved people. Accomplished craftsmen could travel across the crown from one major job to another, linking distant Muslim neighbourhoods and creating wider professional networks. Sometimes that mobility led to resettlement or new investments, such as setting up a dye operation or opening a workshop in a different town. At the same time, the crown's repeated reliance on Muslim labour for sensitive goods, especially weapons and equipment, suggests that certain industries were heavily concentrated among Muslim specialists and had adapted to serve Christian demand. That reality pulled Muslim artisans into daily contact with Christian patrons, supervisors, and co-workers. Shared work sites could be intensely integrated, not only because people laboured side by side, but because pay scales and responsibilities could be comparable across religious lines, when skill and influence mattered more than identity. In some cases, a leading Muslim master could be appointed to oversee major works for years, managing mixed teams and earning a wage that did not drop, simply because a replacement later happened to be Christian. That kind of detail matters, because it shows that hiring Muslims was not always a cheap substitute. It could reflect real recognition of ability and connections. Economic diversification was one of the defining features of Muslim life in the Ebro Valley. Many households did not rely on a single stream of income. A person might combine skilled work, office holding, land interests and livestock. Even elite specialists who served on major construction projects could also manage large herds or hold valuable property, and conflicts over these assets could drag Christian officials into enforcement and recovery when powerful figures tried to seize them. Yet diversification was not limited to elites. Humble artisans often owned or worked land as well, mixing craft income with agriculture to stabilise the household. Christians did this too, but the pattern appears especially visible among Muslim communities, partly because their documentation so often connects craft activity to other economic roles. This wider pattern helps explain why Muslim landholdings sometimes appear smaller than those of Christian settlers in certain records. If many Muslim households were earning money from crafts, trade, offices, or mixed livelihoods, they might not have needed the same scale of agricultural allotment to sustain themselves. When authorities attempted to settle Christian newcomers, they sometimes combined several existing small holdings to create a package they believed could support a new household. That does not automatically signal discrimination. It can just as plausibly reflect differences in efficiency, existing diversification, and the assumptions administrators made about what a Christian settler needed compared with a Muslim household already embedded in local production. Grants and descriptions are often too sketchy and formula-driven to allow clean comparisons anyway, and there are cases where Muslim settlers were promised additional land if the initial allotment proved insufficient. Negotiations over rent and tribute also did not always cut against Muslims. Labour availability, technical expertise, market conditions, and the leverage created by mobility could lead to terms that favoured Muslim tenants, especially when exemptions and different tax obligations changed the real cost of a contract. In a few moments, royal policy even granted broad relief from transport-related charges to Muslims, which looks less like punishment and more like an attempt to stimulate trade and movement. Trade itself did not disappear after conquest. The great commercial networks tied to the old Islamic frontier world were disrupted, and many wealthy long-distance merchants likely left, which would naturally reduce the scale of Muslim participation in international routes. But cross-border exchange continued in smaller practical forms. Muslim traders still moved between neighbouring kingdoms, travelling with permissions and protections that made it possible to cross political lines. Goods that could be sensitive for strategic reasons, like hemp and flax, might normally be restricted, yet exemptions could be granted for limited periods, showing that Muslims were active enough as traders to matter to policy. Individual craftsmen and merchants also appear moving through the crown and in some cases trading as far as the southern Muslim states, suggesting that at least some retain the contacts and ambition to operate beyond local circuits. Inside the crown, Muslim merchant activity is visible in protections for travellers, complaints about seizures, and repeated conflicts over access to markets and river transport. Control of boats and navigation on the Ebro mattered, because it carried grain, oil, and other staples. When authorities or military institutions blocked Muslim movement on the river, it could cripple a community's ability to trade, and therefore to pay taxes. Markets were typically designed to attract sellers and buyers of all faiths, and urban hostels and trading spaces were generally open to everyone. Yet large Muslim neighbourhoods in major cities could also sustain their own dense commercial infrastructure, including specialised lodging and storage areas and substantial numbers of shops and stalls. Visiting traders from surrounding towns could be numerous, and officials sometimes had to be warned not to force them into a particular quarter, a sign that Muslim merchants claimed real choice about where they stayed and where they kept their goods. This economic mobility was not limited to wealthy merchants. Small-scale traders, potters, carpenters, and other craftsmen often moved within a short radius, working markets and job opportunities across multiple towns. Those movements widened social networks among ordinary Muslims, linking villages to cities and connecting Muslim communities to each other. Local marketplaces also acted as communication zones, where Christians, Muslims, and Jews regularly encountered one another as customers, creditors, partners, and rivals. Much of what survives in the record appears through disputes, arguments over grain deals, confiscations, unpaid debts, because conflict generates paperwork. But the sheer frequency of these disputes suggests that interfaith commercial relationships were routine, not rare, and they did not always end badly. We also see normal cooperation, Christians hired by Muslims for herding work, debts repaid between neighbours of different faiths, and everyday transactions that point to a shared economic life even in a society marked by unequal power. Credit was the most obvious place where Christians, Muslims, and Jews met each other in everyday economic life, because borrowing and lending linked households across religious boundaries even when people preferred to keep community affairs separate. Religious teaching in each faith tended to warn against taking interest from one's own group, which quietly pushed lending outward, turning finance into something that often followed sectarian lines. In practice, Jewish lenders became especially prominent. As a smaller but tightly connected community with strong commercial habits and wide networks, Jewish families were able to supply loans on a scale that many others could not match. They also held major positions in the royal financial machine, building client circles that reached into towns and villages. Their importance to the treasury was reinforced by the fact that they contributed a striking share of direct royal taxes, despite being a small share of the overall population, which gave rulers a practical reason to protect their ability to collect debts and keep capital flowing. By the late 13th century, large numbers of Christian and Muslim borrowers lived in chronic shortage, relying on credit to bridge bad harvests, tax demands, and daily expenses, while lenders were stretched by the crown's repeated requests for extraordinary payments. This created a system that could easily tip into crisis. Borrowers with no cushion risked losing land and goods through seizure, while lenders, pressed from above, were tempted toward harsh terms and aggressive collection just to stay solvent. When Muslim debtors tried to delay or escape repayment, their tactics sometimes lined up with the interests of Christian officials and Christian neighbours, producing unlikely alliances. A revealing pattern can be seen in one town over the 1290s, where both communities found themselves pulled into a long struggle against a lender connected to the wider Jewish credit world. Orders came down demanding repayment, but the debtors fought back with procedural arguments, changing the shape of the case again and again until enforcement stalled. At one point, the debtors used the political situation on the frontier as a legal shield, arguing that outsider creditors had lost the right to collect because of war and shifting royal policy. When creditors tried to get around that obstacle by presenting a local agent as the true lender, the Crown accepted the claim on paper and appointed an official to collect the money, yet nothing happened. Deadlines passed, new petitions were filed, and further delays were granted. Years later, when confiscation again threatened, the debtors managed to secure another inquiry, keeping the matter in motion rather than letting it end. This was not simply stalling for its own sake. The strategy became clearer when Muslim debtors began invoking a supposed time limit on old loans, insisting that debts older than 7 years no longer bound them. They presented this as a rule rooted in their own legal tradition, and for a moment it offered a powerful weapon. If accepted, it would wipe out a large portion of outstanding obligations at once. Creditors reacted quickly. mobilizing support from high officials and persuading the king that the claim had no standing in the kingdom's established law. Royal responses grew sharper, describing the rule as a recent invention and ordering collection to proceed. Yet the debtors did not drop it. Similar arguments appeared in other towns as well, suggesting that the idea had spread through Muslim communities as a shared answer to mounting debt. In each case, the crown sided with the longer limitation period recognised by the realm's law and insisted that loan contracts would be judged under that framework, not under a locally asserted rule that conveniently shortened the clock. Even so, the persistence of the 7-year claim hints that it carried real moral or ideological weight for some Muslims, whether drawn from religious reasoning, local legal opinion, or the broader medieval habit of imagining periodic resets of obligation. As the conflict escalated, accusations grew uglier. At one stage, Jewish complainants told the king that Muslims had bribed a man to forge receipts showing loans had been repaid. The royal court reacted with anger and ordered exemplary punishment, signalling that it saw the credibility of written proof and financial order as a line that could not be crossed. Yet the distance between royal outrage and local reality remained wide. Even when confiscation orders existed, enforcement moved slowly. Town officials were not eager to seize the property of their Muslim neighbours, especially when doing so could destabilise local life, damage shared economic routines, or spread fear into the Christian community as well. When seizures finally began, both Christians and Muslims in the town complained that the process was harming them, and the king, rather than forcing the issue at any cost, allowed yet another hearing. Whether the debtors eventually won or lost, they succeeded in dragging the dispute through the courts for more than a decade, forcing creditors into repeated expensive legal action, while the contested money stayed in local hands. It would be easy to frame this story as simple opportunism, but the background suggests something more tense and more human. The debt struggle unfolded alongside heavy tax pressure, internal disputes over who could claim exemptions, and conflicts with church authorities who attempted to extract additional payments. In earlier years, the community had already faced property seizures for unpaid dues and fought bitterly over who should carry the tax burden when land passed into creditors' hands. When creditors took over property, Muslim officials sometimes tried to shift taxes onto the new owners, only to meet resistance, counterclaims and rulings that favoured the better connected side. The result was a grinding sense that the system was tilted by influence as much as by principle. Over time, the Muslim community pressed the crown for relief, and in some cases secured it. Partial remissions, tighter limits on local privilege claims, and reductions of inflated demands that had been imposed for years. These concessions were not gifts of sympathy so much as pressure valves, intended to keep a strategic population stable and loyal while protecting the crown's broader financial interests. What happened in Borja was not an isolated episode. Similar patterns can be seen earlier in other towns, showing that cooperation between Christian officials and Muslim debtors was part of a wider reality rather than an exception. In one such place, Muslim borrowers had fallen into debt during the 1270s. When they failed or refused to repay, royal orders instructed local Christian officials to hand over Muslim property to a Jewish creditor from Zaragoza. Yet enforcement never truly followed. When the creditor attempted to take possession of the land, he was blocked, expelled by force and left without protection. Even after returning with royal authorization that clearly confirmed his rights, local officials again failed to act. Their reluctance suggests that protecting a foreign lender mattered far less to them than maintaining stability and relationships within their own town. Complaints soon followed from other Jewish residents, who accused the same Christian administration of unfair taxation, revealing how selective enforcement could become. A similar pattern unfolded elsewhere when Jewish creditors tried for years to recover money from Muslim debtors, only to be stalled by repeated inaction. Orders to collect were issued, ignored, reissued, and ignored again. Even when the Crown intervened directly, nothing changed on the ground. Over time, creditors were forced into endless legal action, passing contracts onto others or abandoning hope altogether. Court victories, when they came, meant little if officials refused to implement them. This shows that the effectiveness of royal justice depended not only on law, but on local willingness to act. When officials shared interests or sympathies with debtors, enforcement could simply evaporate. Credit disputes often carried a religious tone, but this should not be mistaken for simple religious hostility. Lending across faiths created friction because it touched daily survival, land, crops, animals, and tools. Orders authorizing creditors to seize property inevitably raised tensions. At times, the danger of violence became real enough that kings explicitly ordered Muslim communities to protect visiting lenders. When confrontations did erupt, they often appeared at first glance to be sectarian, but closer inspection usually reveals long-running disputes over money, land, or authority beneath the surface. Jewish lending could act as a catalyst for cooperation between Muslims and Christians, not because of shared ideology, but because their material interests aligned. Officials, debtors, and even rival creditors frequently crossed religious lines when it suited them. Muslim officials sometimes seized property from fellow Muslims to satisfy communal obligations to lenders. In other cases, Christians protested on behalf of Muslims when confiscations appeared abusive. Even the practice of charging interest was not limited to one faith. Muslims were prosecuted for lending at illegal rates, just as Jews and Christians were. Kings repeatedly reminded Muslim courts that their own law forbade usury among Muslims, just as royal law limited interest for everyone else. Resistance to repayment was therefore not confined to disputes with Jewish lenders. Muslims defaulted on loans from Christians, Christians defaulted on loans from Muslims, and members of every community tried to delay, renegotiate, or escape obligations when circumstances allowed. Royal courts are full of cases where borrowers of all faiths were accused of malicious refusal to pay, just as they are full of complaints from debtors who claimed oppression by lenders. Even within the same religious group, trust did not guarantee safety. Jewish lenders struggled to collect from Jewish borrowers, and Muslim creditors faced the same risks as anyone else. Commerce always carried danger, regardless of shared belief. The frequency of debt cases in royal record should not give the impression that lending was dysfunctional or unprofitable. On the contrary, credit remained attractive precisely because it worked often enough to be worth the risk. Interest rates were officially regulated, but violations were common, and rulers intervened repeatedly to curb abusive practices. At times, kings stepped in to shield Muslim communities from excessive interest, ordering lenders to respect legal limits. Such intervention suggests not favoritism, but concern for maintaining balance in a system where too much pressure could collapse local economies. Muslims were not only absorbed into the administrative and tax systems of the crown, their integration into the wider economy was even deeper and more complex. Their everyday interactions with Christians and Jews took many forms. They worked as tenants and landlords, bought and sold goods, practiced trades, borrowed money, and acted as lenders. Through these activities, Muslim communities became woven into local networks of labour, trade, and credit. While most Muslims, like most Christians, were involved in agriculture, many households combined farming with other economic pursuits. This reality challenges the familiar image of Muslims as a uniformly oppressed, isolated rural population cut off by religion. In the Ebro region especially, a significant portion of Muslims lived active economic lives that defied this stereotype. Participation in Christian legal and administrative systems became unavoidable as Muslims engaged in work, services, and commerce. Over time, they learned not only how these systems functioned, but how to exploit their weaknesses. Legal delays, forged documents, manipulated procedures, and strategic use of royal privileges became tools of survival and advantage. These practices were not signs of passivity but of adaptation. Comparable patterns can be observed centuries later in colonial societies, where subject populations adopted the legal tactics of their rulers when direct resistance failed. Markets played a key role in reshaping social relations after conquest. Economic exchange loosened older, tightly bound community structures and placed individuals into broader networks that crossed village, ethnic and religious boundaries. Temporary partnerships formed around landholding, labour and tenancy, linking people who otherwise shared little in common. These overlapping networks help explain why relations between religious groups in this period were so varied and situational, shaped as much by circumstance as by belief. By the 13th century, Muslims occupied many different economic roles across the crown. Like Christians and Jews, they often specialised in certain activities, which encouraged group identities at one level. Yet these tendencies were constantly reshaped by personal opportunity, local conditions, and individual ambition. Religious boundaries did not always align with social or economic ones. While administrative and economic structures can be traced clearly through surviving records, social life is far harder to reconstruct. The sources rarely describe social dynamics directly, and later observers often idealized Islamic society in ways that discouraged closer scrutiny. As a result, Muslims under Christian rule were too often treated as a single, undifferentiated group. In reality, Muslim society was internally divided, shaped by status, wealth, and power as much as by religion. Two groups stood apart within Muslim communities. At the top was a small urban elite that controlled administration and acted as intermediaries between Christian authorities and Muslim populations. At the bottom were slaves, who despite their low status played an important role in cultural exchange. Contact with Christian households exposed slaves to new customs, while the arrival of slaves from Islamic lands reinforced Muslim language and religious practice once they gained freedom. Language and religion functioned in two directions at once. Arabic and Islam helped maintain internal cohesion and confidence within Muslim communities, while also marking boundaries between Muslims and others. At the same time, the growing use of Latin and Romance languages encouraged cross-religious interaction. Christian influence, visible in daily practice as much as belief, offers valuable insight into both the internal condition of Muslim society and its place within the larger political order. Muslim society in the Ebro Valley was never uniform. This diversity must be recognised when discussing adaptation and integration after conquest. Two social layers deserve particular attention. The first was the urban administrative elite, which stood at the top of the hierarchy and served as the main channel through which Christian authority reached Muslim communities. These figures interacted regularly with Christian and Jewish counterparts, sometimes as partners, sometimes as rivals. The second group was the enslaved population, which occupied a low social position but remained closely connected to Christian society and acted as a conduit for cultural change. Freed slaves, especially those from abroad, often reintroduced Islamic traditions into local Muslim life. Within Muslim towns, administrative leadership was dominated by a small group of merchants and skilled tradesmen. This was hardly accidental. Commercial success provided the means to purchase offices and maintain influence. Once in power, these officials often treated their positions as hereditary property, passing them from father to son. Administrative continuity followed direct family lines rather than extended kinship networks, suggesting that older clan structures had largely faded by this period. It was common for a single individual to hold several offices at once, concentrating authority and reinforcing elite dominance. This consolidation helped create a narrow ruling class that stood apart from the rest of the Muslim population. Despite the obvious potential for abuse, this system does not appear to have been widely challenged in principle by Muslim communities. Wealth accumulation was encouraged by multiple advantages. Office holders earned income from their duties, benefited from court connections, and often received tax exemptions. These privileges frequently extended to their families and were sometimes granted permanently. Such exemptions provoked resentment among ordinary Muslims and sparked long legal conflicts, which now provide much of what is known about elite families. Despite their status, officials were never fully detached from community life. Personal rivalries, factional disputes, and family conflicts regularly drew them into internal struggles. While violence was rare, it did occur, and officials often used their administrative power to advance personal interests. Attempts to shift personal debts onto communal responsibility were not uncommon, and occasionally involved coordinated efforts among several elite families. These episodes reveal a strong sense of class solidarity among elite Muslims, who often acted together against poorer members of their own community. Similar abuses appear repeatedly in the record, including embezzlement and misuse of communal funds. Elite influence extended beyond formal office. Relatives of officials were sometimes appointed as judges or arbitrators, even when their only qualification was family connection. Such appointments were meant to resolve disputes, but often reinforced existing power structures instead. The most prominent example of this elite culture is provided by one exceptionally wealthy family based in Zaragoza. Their rise was built on skilled crafts, trade and lending. Over time, they expanded their influence beyond their home city, acquiring property, extending credit across religious lines, and even financing Christian nobles. Their wealth created friction with other Muslims, leading to legal disputes and occasional violence. Although their fortune exceeded that of most Muslims, the experiences of this family were not unique. Legal battles over taxes, complex debt relations, and internal conflicts were common features of elite Muslim life. What made this family unusual was the scale of their wealth rather than the nature of their behaviour. By the mid-13th century, a new Muslim upper class had clearly emerged. Unlike the elites of the pre-conquest period, their power rested not on traditional Islamic authority but on commerce and cooperation with Christian rule. Their influence rarely extended far beyond their local region, and cross-community ties usually reflected practical connections rather than dynastic ambition. These families occupied an uneasy middle position. They led Muslim communities while simultaneously serving the Christian state. Their offices retained Islamic names but had lost much of their original religious content. Traditional safeguards against abuse no longer functioned as they once had. Judicial authority was fragmented, appointments were flexible, and royal discretion overrode earlier norms. In some towns, multiple judges operated simultaneously, illustrating how far these institutions had drifted from their original form. In these Muslim communities under Christian power, leadership often blended religious prestige with practical authority. In many Islamic societies, this overlap between sacred roles and everyday professions was normal. But under Christian rule, the pattern took on a sharper edge. Poor Muslims, even when respected for devotion, rarely gained real influence. When a young official in Huesca was removed after complaints from his own community, the criticism was not only about temperament and immaturity, it also emphasized his lack of property and standing, showing that power increasingly depended on wealth and social weight, not simply learning or piety. This created a class of Muslim leaders who lived in an in-between world. They were expected to speak for their community, yet they also served as a bridge to Christian institutions. In practice, they could align themselves with ordinary Muslims when outside pressure threatened the community, but they could just as easily cooperate with elites from other towns when trade, administration, or personal advantage was at stake. This double identity explains why these local ruling circles often looked like tight cliques, managing both authority and culture, while constantly shifting their loyalties according to situation. The records highlight these officials most clearly, but they were not the only Muslims with power. Many prosperous Muslims likely stayed under the ordinary tax system of their communities, and therefore left fewer traces. Still, occasional glimpses appear. In one case, a Muslim woman's home was attacked and stripped of luxury items and cash, suggesting she possessed notable wealth. The raid involved outsiders from different faiths, and the situation carried an obvious risk of scandal because a Christian soldier had been staying in her household. The legal process also reveals another pattern that appeared again and again. Local authorities sometimes delayed, resisted, or undermined investigations, forcing the Crown to pressure officials into acting and restoring stolen property. Beyond such incidents, evidence shows that many Muslims pursued investment strategies rather than mere subsistence. Some bought additional workshops, others accumulated multiple rural holdings, and some entered complex tenancy arrangements that went well beyond what a household would need simply to survive. Muslim agents were even hired to recruit settlers for new villages, which implies access to independent funds and the ability to operate across distances. By the 14th century, at least some Muslims owned several houses and even large residences outside major cities, a sign that significant private fortunes existed below the level of the official elite. At the other end of the social ladder stood a large population often overlooked when discussing Muslim life under Christian rule: enslaved Muslims. The boundary between enslaved people and free Muslim communities was not rigid. It shifted constantly, and the enslaved shaped the wider character of Muslim society in powerful ways. Many enslaved Muslims were taken from abroad through raids, maritime attacks, or trade, and then moved through an extensive distribution network. Coastal ports served as main entry points, while inland towns functioned as regional marketplaces where captives could be resold. Free Muslims could also be pulled into slavery through legal and financial mechanisms. Because Muslims were considered the Crown's protected subjects, community courts faced limits on severe punishments. Executions and disfiguring penalties were often restricted, and in certain serious cases authorities instead converted punishment into enforced bondage, effectively destroying a person's social existence without physically killing them. Sometimes this was used as a substitute for a death sentence. In other cases, debt default pushed Muslims into forced service, especially when they failed to repay obligations tied to taxes or guarantees. Even so, formal enslavement through court sentences appears less frequently in surviving records than might be expected. Some Muslims convicted of grave crimes were executed, while others paid enormous sums to secure pardon. In the most shocking offences, punishments applied across religious lines, meaning that Muslims, Christians, and others could face the same brutal outcomes. More commonly, the Crown used coercion around debts and payments, turning bondage into a tool for extracting money rather than a standard criminal penalty. Another reality must be faced. Alongside the legal slave trade, a shadow market flourished. The profitability of human trafficking, the widespread ownership of slaves, and the difficulty of proving someone's status made illegal enslavement dangerously common. Muslim families were frequent targets. Women and children were kidnapped and quietly sold in other regions, moved across internal borders to make tracing harder. Communities complained about raids that carried off boys along with livestock, and royal orders demanded investigations, rescues, and exemplary punishment. Some cases reveal networks of helpers, including local Christians who assisted kidnappers. Because different parts of the Crown had their own jurisdictions, traffickers could move captives across internal frontiers and hide them behind distance and legal complexity. Royal authorities responded with inspections and large-scale checks, demanding proof of lawful purchase. When irregularities were discovered, officials could order captives freed and sometimes required refunds to buyers, showing an attempt to protect free Muslims while also stabilising markets that depended on documentation. These dangers did not affect Muslims alone. Christians, especially children, were also abducted and sold illegally, sometimes disguised as Muslims to make the sale easier. Courts became arenas where enslaved people contested their status, and families sought the return of stolen children. Repeat offenders emerge in the record, individuals and couples known for exploiting both Muslims and Christians, seizing property, abusing communities, and participating in local factional struggles. The difference, however, was that Muslims tied to powerful Christian institutions through lordship arrangements were often better protected, since their Christian patrons could intervene more effectively than an isolated Muslim family could. The same world of maritime raids and commerce produced both legal and illegal trafficking. Merchants and privateers who captured enemies in wartime could also seize protected foreigners or even attack Christian traders when profit tempted them. Because of treaties and truces, rulers sometimes demanded the release and return of captives and goods taken unlawfully, including foreign Muslims who were travelling under royal protection. Orders also insisted that detainees be fed properly and not mistreated while negotiations unfolded. Over time, a rough but recognisable diplomatic system grew around the treatment and return of captives, even when it conflicted with religious hostility. To manage this chaotic human marketplace, the Crown developed a system of verification. Just as travel permissions monitored movement inside the realm, slave ownership increasingly depended on written proof. Sales documents and customs receipts became the key markers of legality. The state had a strong financial reason for this. A major tax was due on war booty and imported captives, and owners were expected to produce proof that the required payment had been made. These papers usually described the captive clearly, often noting age, gender, appearance, and sometimes a name or occupation. They also included promises that the captive was genuinely enslaved, not unlawfully abducted, not taken from protected Allied territory, and not secretly a free subject of the Crown. When owners could not produce documentation, officials sometimes seized captives until the matter was clarified. Investigations checked the claimed origin of the enslaved person, and, when proof was missing or testimony suggested kidnapping, authorities could order liberation. These actions show the Crown walking a tightrope. It wanted revenue and control, it accepted slavery as part of war and commerce, but it also needed to prevent free subjects from being swallowed by a predatory black market. In the end, paperwork became the thin line separating lawful captivity from criminal theft of human lives, and the struggle to enforce that line reveals how vulnerable Muslim communities could be, especially at the margins of power and wealth. When we look at Muslim life under Christian rule, a clear pattern appears. The people at both ends of the social ladder helped pull Muslim communities into the wider society of the Crown, and at the same time they helped keep Islamic identity alive. At the top stood local Muslim leaders who did not have the wealth or prestige of older frontier elites, and they could not support grand courts or fund high Islamic scholarship. Still, they played an important cultural role. Through taste, influence, and daily authority, they helped preserve Islamic styles in buildings, decoration, crafts, and popular entertainment, and they provided leadership that grew from within the community itself. At the bottom of society, enslaved Muslims arriving from Islamic lands carried something equally important. They brought language, habits, and knowledge that refreshed local Muslim life, even if native Muslims did not always welcome every influence. Together with merchants and travellers moving back and forth, the slave system created a constant circulation between the Christian north and the Islamic south. People were always moving in both directions, some by choice and some by force, and that movement acted like a steady current that kept local Muslim society connected to the broader Muslim world. At the same time, enslaved people and outsiders were exposed to Christian customs through intimate domestic roles inside Christian households. That made them unexpected carriers of cultural influence in the other direction. They could bring new habits, expectations, and behaviours into Muslim communities through ongoing contact or after gaining freedom. Meanwhile, the Muslim leadership class was often attracted to the outward signs of Christian prestige. As trendsetters, they helped normalise certain Western styles and practices within their own communities. Because Muslim society included many layers and life situations, Muslims interacted with Christians at multiple levels, joining social and economic circles that were not purely Muslim. This produced familiarity, informal cross-religious networks, and a more complicated image of the Muslim minority than stereotypes would suggest. Religion and language remained central. Even after Arabic and Islam lost their public status under Christian power, they continued to define Muslim identity in everyday life. Yet identity was never shaped by religion alone. Over time, even when Muslims were pushed away from Islam, they often remained a distinct group in the eyes of society. Christian pressure also helped shape Muslim identity, not only through explicit attempts to convert them, but also because Christian rituals and symbols seeped into public life and even ordinary social practices. When conversion became a real possibility, it could trigger resistance, and resistance itself shaped community culture. Conversion often appeals most strongly to those who feel excluded or undervalued, so understanding who was tempted to abandon Islam can reveal where the cracks and tensions existed inside Muslim society. Language also mattered, even if medieval people did not define ethnicity the way modern societies do. This was a world where powerful shared languages existed alongside developing local vernaculars. Arabic remained in active use among Muslims in both speech and writing, from everyday communication to more educated forms. Arabic writing also helped stabilize community life, because Muslims maintained their own record-keeping traditions that supported internal order and confidence. One of the clearest places we see this is in Muslim documentation. Muslim scribes were essential, and their role was not easily replaced by Christians because the job required Arabic and familiarity with Muslim legal habits. These scribes produced documents in Arabic and also worked with Latin when needed. Under Christian rule, written proof became even more valuable. Contracts, receipts, agreements, and legal records gained new power because disputes increasingly depended on paperwork. Even if few Arabic archives survived, that does not mean they never existed. When Muslim communities later disappeared, there was little reason for institutions to preserve their internal records. Most Arabic documents that did survive did so because they eventually became relevant to Christian institutions, land ownership, or legal disputes. We also see signs of mixed language practice. Some agreements existed in both languages, and the two versions were not always direct translations. That suggests many deals were negotiated orally, then written separately using each side's formal legal style, shaped by different expectations. In other words, the same agreement could mean one thing to a Christian institution and another to a Muslim party, even when both believed they had reached a clear understanding. This helps explain why legal conflicts could arise later, not only from dishonesty, but from different cultural assumptions about what a contract actually meant. Muslim communities also kept records for practical survival. Authorities sometimes demanded that local Muslim leaders produce their books for inspection, covering taxes, property transfers, inheritances, and legal judgments. These inspections show that Muslim communities were expected to maintain extensive documentation and that written records could protect them or condemn them. Muslim leaders understood this and used documents as tools in court, especially in long disputes over debts and taxes. Keeping paperwork became a survival strategy, and Muslim notaries gained power as gatekeepers. If a document was written in Arabic, most royal officials could not read it directly, which gave Muslim scribes a strong intermediary role between the rulers and the community. Meanwhile, Latin and local Romance languages pulled Muslims into Christian systems. In many parts of the Ebro region, Muslims became comfortable using Latin and Romance legal documents, not only in dealings with Christians, but in everyday transactions as well. Translators appear less often than we might expect, which suggests bilingual ability, or at least working familiarity, was common. This helped Muslims adapt quickly to Christian legal norms. Instead of being pushed to the margins by paperwork, many learned to use it aggressively. Legal strategy, careful documentation, and sometimes deliberate confusion of records could become weapons in disputes, especially in complicated cases involving loans, interest, and long-running litigation. This blending of traditions shows up even in timekeeping. Muslim communities continued to use the Islamic calendar in many Arabic documents, while Christian systems were often used in Latin records. Sometimes the two were combined, depending on context. There was no simple straight-line shift from one calendar to the other. Practical needs mattered. When contracts dealt with farming and seasonal work, the Christian solar calendar often made more sense because it matched the rhythms of the agricultural year. In other contexts, Islamic dating remained natural and meaningful. The result was not replacement, but flexibility. Two systems coexisted, mixed, and were chosen according to what best served the moment. Christians in the crown were not completely cut off from Arabic, even if their political dominance meant they had less reason to learn it. Still, anyone whose work crossed religious lines could pick up the spoken language well enough to trade, negotiate, or manage everyday contact. Some missionaries went further, aiming for highly educated Arabic so they could debate theology and philosophy directly with Muslim scholars. And in the world of war and diplomacy, commanders who spent years working alongside Muslim rulers would almost certainly have absorbed at least practical Arabic, the kind used to give orders, bargain and survive in mixed company. Even outside these exceptional circles, there were Christians known for speaking rough, everyday Arabic, useful in tense negotiations and surrender talks when a few accurate phrases could prevent bloodshed. Because of this, we should not assume that the royal administration relied on Jewish Arabic scribes simply because Christians could not learn Arabic or because Muslims were automatically distrusted. A more realistic explanation is that Jews were exceptionally skilled at securing high administrative roles in this period. Many had the linguistic training, the education, and the court connections needed to serve rulers effectively. A royal official who combined learning, medical expertise, and strong family networks was the kind of person kings trusted with delicate work, especially when it involved official correspondence, diplomacy, and languages used beyond the Christian world. Other Jewish officials gained similar positions after proving themselves in negotiations with Muslim powers and building reputations as reliable agents of the crown. At the same time, Muslims were not completely excluded from serving as interpreters or language intermediaries. While they rarely rose into the highest layers of administration, they could be trusted in situations where accuracy mattered and where misunderstanding could derail campaigns, surrender agreements, or foreign missions. When a Muslim town sent a letter in Arabic to a Christian king, local Muslims could be called on to interpret it. Lesser officials and royal agents travelling into Muslim lands also sometimes relied on Muslim companions who could translate, navigate customs, and bridge cultural gaps. Inside Muslim communities, bilingual life was likely normal. The documents do not always describe spoken language directly, because most surviving records focus on land, taxes, and legal decisions rather than everyday conversation. But when court cases and official proceedings capture real speech and practical communication, we see clear evidence that Muslims could speak the common tongues of the realm. Daily life in the Ebro Valley involved constant contact across faith lines, and the near absence of translators in many routine dealings strongly suggests that most Muslims could manage local Romance speech confidently. Even some foreign Muslims seem to have learned Romance as well. At the same time, the survival of Arabic as a spoken language does not automatically mean Muslims were isolated. Communities can remain highly connected while still preserving a language that carries identity, memory, and group values. Learning a second language does not require losing the first, and in a frontier society it is far more likely that most Muslims were multilingual. Language therefore worked in two directions at once. Arabic helped maintain internal cohesion and cultural confidence, while Romance and Latin opened doors into Christian legal and economic systems. Together, these languages allowed Muslims to remain distinct, while also functioning inside a shared public world. The idea that Muslims in Aragon and Catalonia were religiously cut off also seems unlikely. Trade, travel, and the steady movement of people through the Ebro region would have carried religious knowledge and customs across long distances. Scholars, merchants, and family networks could connect Muslim communities in the different parts of the crown. Children might be sent to study under relatives in major towns, and respected Muslim legal figures could travel to supervise disputes or advise communities. Borders were not absolute barriers. Even movement across frontier zones was possible when officials granted safe passage, and business ties often pushed people to cross regions repeatedly. In one sense, Islam could survive even with limited outside contact, because it does not require a rigid priestly hierarchy to continue basic religious life. Everyday worship and community discipline can be maintained through shared norms and family structures. But Christian rule clearly changed Muslim religious life in important ways. Official Muslim judicial structures were narrowed and localized, and older patterns of wider authority were weakened. Even so, this could be balanced by the continued movement of informal teachers and religious specialists who traveled, preached, advised, and helped keep religious knowledge consistent across different towns. Evidence also suggests that Muslim religious life remained strong. Church restrictions that aimed to limit non-Christian worship were not always enforced strictly by local authorities. Muslims could obtain permission for building work connected to worship, and even when documents do not spell out whether a mosque was being repaired or expanded, the very act of maintaining communal worship space signals confidence and continuity. These buildings were not only religious sites, they were social centres, places of education, legal discussion, record-keeping, and community organisation. Maintaining them helped preserve identity in a world where public prestige had shifted to Christianity. Jewish communities also benefited from this practical tolerance, receiving permissions for their own communal buildings and activities. We can also see religious vitality in moments when Muslims drew firm boundaries. When they believed they were being forced into supporting Christian worship financially, they protested. Paying taxes required by law was one thing, but being drawn into funding church decoration or ritual lighting could be seen as crossing a line. In some cases, the Crown responded by ordering money returned, showing that rulers understood the risk of pushing too far and provoking unrest. Yet Muslims could also compromise when it served survival. A fugitive might seek refuge in a church because church sanctuary was powerful, and local authorities might hesitate to violate it until the king intervened and insisted that such protection should not apply to non-Christians. These episodes reveal a constant negotiation. Boundaries mattered, but necessity often forced creative choices. Conversion to Christianity is one of the clearest ways to measure religious pressure, yet it is also the hardest to track in this period. The records we would want most, routine parish registers, do not survive for the early 13th century. Conversions also become harder to trace because Muslim converts often adopted names that blended easily into Christian society. Still, both church and crown openly promoted conversion. The age was marked by intense religious campaigns, and new preaching movements were embraced enthusiastically across the realm. These preachers were trained to argue, teach, and persuade, and they studied Arabic and Hebrew to confront Islam and Judaism directly. Missionary preaching was always going to struggle, because it often aimed at the wrong target. For most people, faith is not mainly a puzzle solved by logic. It is lived through community, memory, emotion, and daily habit. Yet the sermons and public debates tried to dismantle Islam and Judaism with tightly argued reasoning built on scriptures that the audience did not accept as binding in the first place. Even educated listeners had little reason to surrender a whole way of life, when the arguments rarely touched the deeper social and spiritual roots that made Islam meaningful. As the 13th century gave way to the 14th and these campaigns produced few results, the mood hardened. Language schools closed, patience thinned, and some former champions of gentle persuasion began to argue for harsher solutions, even imagining force as a shortcut to religious enlightenment. Still, conversion did happen, and not always because a preacher delivered a perfect argument. Christianity was the public face of power in the crown. It carried the prestige of the victors and the appearance of having been proven by worldly success. Constant contact with Christian customs made the new faith familiar, and familiarity can soften resistance. Conversion could also offer very practical rewards. A change of religion could open doors in administration, lifting the invisible ceiling that often blocked a minority from promotion. Outside government, it could make it easier to join parish networks, guild circles, and confraternities that shaped business life, reputation, and everyday protection. In other cases, conversion could be used as an escape route from trouble, a way to step out of lawsuits, debts, accusations, or dangerous conflicts. In a society where law and community were deeply tied to religion, changing faith could function like changing jurisdictions. But we should not imagine this was a casual choice. A sincere convert may have been driven by conviction, and we cannot rule out real belief. Yet the social price was usually severe. Marriage was one of the first fault lines. If one spouse converted and the other did not, the union could not survive under the combined pressure of Christian rules and Islamic legal expectations. Inheritance created another rupture. Property and family rights were typically handled through the community's own legal system, so a convert could lose claims to family wealth and be treated as if they had been cut off from the household entirely. Over time, a few converts managed to fight for inheritance despite resistance. But in many cases, conversion meant losing one's place in the family's economic world. Inside Muslim communities, converts could be seen as traitors, especially in an environment where Christianity actively tried to win souls. That hostility shows up in royal warnings. When Muslims or Jews insulted or attacked new Christians, rulers sometimes responded by pulling such disputes out of minority legal protections and placing them under Christian courts and penalties. In other words, conversion could trigger real danger, not only from former friends and relatives, but also from legal escalation once the Crown decided to treat attacks on converts as an offence against the dominant faith itself. The emotional intensity of these conflicts appears in personal stories. A father might pay heavily to redeem an enslaved child, only to demand his money back when he learned she had become Christian, before the transaction was complete. That reaction shows how conversion could be experienced as a loss more painful than captivity itself. Yet even then, relationships did not always collapse completely. Some converts maintained old ties, and the records occasionally hint at cooperation between converts and Muslims in acts that drew royal attention. Once someone crossed the line, though, there was no safe return. Rejoining Islam after baptism was treated as apostasy and could be punished with death and confiscation. The dominant system demanded permanence. Because of these pressures, it is not surprising that most recorded conversions involved slaves. Enslaved people lived inside Christian households, absorbed language and routines, and often lacked the protective web of family and community that might resist conversion. Baptism could also offer a path toward freedom, or at least a better status, even if the reality was complicated. Conversion could happen not only toward Christianity, but, more rarely, toward the religion of a minority owner, which authorities treated as a serious crime. Switching between minority faiths under Christian rule was still framed as apostasy, and punishment could be harsh. These cases reveal that rulers cared not only about belief, but about controlling the boundaries of community and law. In theory, Christian law rejected the enslavement of Christians, and church decrees tried to limit non-Christians' control over Christian bodies. That made baptism attractive for slaves, because it could strengthen their claim to protection. Yet owners resisted. Authorities responded with barriers designed to reduce financial losses. Councils recommended waiting periods to test whether a would-be convert was sincere. Special rules were created to restrict when certain slaves could seek baptism. Other rules required converts to compensate owners or forced a sale to a Christian buyer so the previous owner could recover money. Even when the church insisted that a sincere convert should not be blocked, everyday intimidation, confinement, and economic pressure could still stand in the way. Forced conversion of free Muslims was not typical in this period, and when coercion appears, it is usually tied to slavery, domestic life, or sexual exploitation. In some places, testamentary manumission was linked to baptism, creating pressure on slaves to accept conversion as the price of freedom. Another recurring situation involved children born from unions between Christian men and Muslim women, often enslaved women. Municipal rules might declare that such children must be raised Christian, and sometimes promised freedom for the mother, but enforcement was inconsistent and depended on power, influence, and convenience. Even when a ruler ordered a baptism in a specific sale, it often served to manage scandal or social disorder rather than protect the vulnerable. There is one striking example of a wider forced baptism driven by local Christians, but the crown treated it as lawless violence rather than holy zeal and demanded punishment. Later evidence shows that the Muslim community in that area continued to exist, suggesting the conversion was ignored, reversed, or dismissed as invalid. This exposes a deeper contradiction. Kings and powerful church institutions profited from Muslim communities through taxes, rents, labour, and stable agricultural production. A sudden wave of genuine conversions could threaten that income. So behind grand missionary declarations, economic realities often quietly protected the existence of Muslim society. In daily practice, Muslim contact with the church was usually not spiritual but financial and legal. Monasteries, cathedrals, and military orders treated Muslim communities as productive assets. Their relationship was often about crops, rents, and dues, rather than pastoral care. Most disputes that emerge in the records are not theological battles but conflicts over payments. Even then, the church's language could be restrained, focusing on legal compliance rather than holy war rhetoric. This tells us that the missionary ideal, the uncertainty surrounding conversion, is also visible in how converts were labelled. New Christians often carried an intermediate identity, neither fully accepted as part of the old community, nor fully trusted by the new one. The label used for them could follow them for years, sometimes even attaching to their children. This reveals how medieval society understood religion not only as belief, but as belonging, like membership in a people. Converts might be rejected by Muslims as betrayers, and viewed by Christians as suspicious turncoats. Authorities even punished people for insulting converts, with labels that implied treachery, treating such slander as a serious offence. Now that we have a working picture of how Muslim communities in the Ebro Valley were organised, the next step is to watch them in motion, side by side with Christians and Jews. The most revealing moments are often the ones that involve protection and risk. Who was expected to defend the town, the valley, the ruler's wider realm, and the local economy? Who saw this as a right, who treated it as a burden, and who tried to turn it into an advantage? In a period remembered through the language of crusade and reconquest, religious identity mattered, but it did not explain everything. The frontier was not only a line of armies, it was also a corridor of trade, skills, and cultural borrowing. And the everyday reality of mixed towns, so often praised or dismissed under the idea of coexistence, can be approached only through the themes the records mention most often: sexual conflict, communal violence, theft, and crime. The evidence is patchy, but it is still enough to map where Muslim life was restricted, and where religious division was less decisive than economics, local rivalries, and simple human opportunism. A regional community is hard to measure, but one useful indicator is the question of shared security. Defence does not only mean battlefield service, it includes guarding castles, repairing walls, protecting harvests, and resisting outside threats that could ruin a town's livelihood. If Christians and Muslims could cooperate in these areas, it suggests a sense of practical partnership, even when distrust existed in theory. It also opens a darker possibility. Common cause could sometimes lead to joint violence, not because religious hatred disappeared, but because local solidarity or shared profit could override it. One classic way a dominant group sidelines a minority is by taking away the right to bear arms. Such bans can be practical because rulers fear rebellion, but they are also symbolic because they declare who is fully trusted. In many Islamic settings, non-Muslims were formally excluded from military roles, and the tax on non-Muslims could be justified through that exclusion. Yet in the Crown of Aragon during the 13th century, Muslims generally did carry weapons and did serve. The fact that some Muslims complained when officials tried to tax their knives shows that weapon ownership was understood not simply as tolerated, but as something they believed they were entitled to keep. Only later did the idea take hold that Muslim arms were inherently threatening, and even then enforcement could be inconsistent. Early surrender terms sometimes excused Muslims from broader warfare, limiting them to local defence. But as royal authority tightened, periodic service became a general obligation. Muslims were summoned when emergencies struck, including major invasions, and they were threatened with penalties if they stayed home. In some towns, officials were instructed to give Muslim soldiers the same short breathing space from debts that other returning fighters received. Sometimes entire Muslim communities were excused from cash payments precisely because they were expected to show up in person. What they did in the field is not always spelled out, but their reputation for crossbow skill appears again and again. Some Muslim fighters were remembered almost as professionals, defined in lists and orders by their weapon and role. Stories circulated about remarkable accuracy from the walls of besieged towns, the kind of anecdote that only spreads when a skill is widely recognised and feared. Whether Muslim fighters served in separate units under their own leaders or in mixed detachments is harder to pin down. The documents hint at both patterns. Mixed groups of Muslim and Christian crossbowmen appear together in contexts that sound like a single organised body, while other evidence suggests that in certain regions Muslims might have mustered under their own hierarchy. Foreign Muslim cavalrymen also entered the picture and sometimes even commanded Christians. The overall impression is not of a rigidly segregated army, but of a flexible system shaped by need, local custom, and the ruler's judgment. Military obligations could be converted into money, but that should not automatically be read as distrust. Cash substitutions were common across society and fit a wider trend toward turning services into coin payments. In some years, a community might be told to join a campaign or pay a fixed sum. In other years, the same town might be fined for not appearing, even if earlier it had been praised for service. This kind of inconsistency often reflects shifting priorities more than changing attitudes. A ruler might want soldiers one season and revenue the next. It also suggests that communities were judged individually. Loyalty could be evaluated locally, and policies could differ from town to town. Beyond royal campaigns, villagers were expected to help defend their own land. When noble rebellions threatened stability, Muslims were ordered to shelter in castles and reinforce garrisons, just as Christians were. Specific Muslim leaders were sometimes told to post a set number of men inside a fortress, not as symbolic hostages, but as active defenders. This raises a larger question about municipal militias and councils, the paramilitary civic bodies that often shaped frontier towns. Many historians assume Muslims were kept out, and the silence of some records supports that. But other evidence cuts the other way. There are clear moments when Muslims appear inside a town's broader council, acting not as outsiders with a separate life, but as members of a combined corporate community. One case shows a town council described as the whole council, Christians and Muslims together, represented by both faiths. During a wartime cattle dispute between neighbouring areas, the mixed council seized animals and was later ordered to pay compensation. The important point is not the theft itself, but the shared responsibility. Payment was made partly in cash and partly in livestock, implying coordinated communal action and shared legal liability. If Muslims were truly separate from municipal life, they would have had strong grounds to refuse collective punishment. Instead, the record shows a joint civic body behaving like a single organism. Similar episodes appear elsewhere. In one complaint, a local official led a mixed band of Christians and Muslims to rustle a large herd. In another, a Muslim captor was involved in a ransom situation shaped by interstate diplomacy, suggesting Muslim fighters could operate in the same rough military economy as Christians. There are also hints that Muslim villagers were pushed by powerful Christian lords to join private feuds and raids. The ruler's concern in these cases was often not the religious mixing, but the violation of privileges or the disturbance of public order. That tells us something crucial. In many intertown raids by the late 13th century, the target was not the other faith, but the rival town. The front line had moved far south, and in the Ebro Valley, local aggression often followed municipal rivalries more than religious ideology. In that setting, Muslim participation in raids becomes easier to understand. Still, military service was never just a straightforward duty. It was also a source of friction inside mixed communities, especially when towns had to decide who paid what. Disputes could turn ugly when Christians believed Muslims were dodging burdens, or when Muslims felt they were being squeezed beyond their share. A long conflict in one village shows how this played out. Obligations had been laid down for both Christians and Muslims, including campaign service and mounted duties. In one levy, Muslims were assigned a smaller payment than Christians. Later they pleaded poverty and were excused by special grace. Over time, they tried to turn that temporary pardon into a permanent exemption. When a church-appointed official forced them to march, they protested that it was done violently with threats against their property. An inquiry later ruled in the Muslims' favour, and goods seized from them were ordered returned. But the victory came at a cost. Relations soured. Muslims complained of harassment, property damage, and home invasions. The conflict widened into taxation, with Christians allegedly forcing Muslims to pay for levies that should not have touched them. Even after a legal decision favoured the Muslims, townsmen tried again to compel service. The pattern reveals something that matters for a documentary narrative. Law could protect a minority on paper, and even in verdicts, yet daily pressure from neighbours could still make life unbearable, and the economic aftershock could be real. A wave of bankruptcies soon followed, suggesting that social hostility could translate into credit problems, business obstruction, and financial collapse. At the same time, exemptions from service show that military obligation was not only oppression. Being freed from campaign duty could be granted as a privilege, a reward for useful work, or a recognition of special responsibilities. Some Muslims received lifelong freedom from military duties and the cash payments that substituted for them. Others were excused temporarily because they were needed to guard a castle or maintain critical infrastructure like bridges. An exemption did not mean a ban from service. In fact, it could reinforce belonging by treating the person as someone whose role mattered enough to warrant special treatment, even while it also marked them as different. Yet the hardest test came when Muslims were asked to contribute to wars against other Muslims. Here, rulers sometimes signalled that they did not want Muslim communities marching in person, preferring to take money instead. That could reflect sensitivity, distrust, or simple practicality. In some cases, the ruler may have needed cash more than manpower. In others, it may have been a calculation that forcing Muslims to fight fellow Muslims would create unnecessary tension or risk. But avoidance of service was not uniquely Muslim. Campaign duty was a tax in flesh and coin, and people of every faith tried to escape it. Royal orders complaining about non-compliance and desertion among Christians show that even the dream of fighting the infidel did not always inspire obedience. Defence also meant building and maintaining walls, towers and gates. In times of danger, orders went out to Christians, Muslims and Jews alike to repair fortifications. These commands were framed as a common good, necessary for everyone's safety, yet they still met resistance. Officials complained that people dragged their feet, forcing the crown to push harder. In other moments, Muslim participation in defence was praised and rewarded. Some communities received remissions on unrelated taxes as recognition for taking up arms to protect their town. Others were excused from collective penalties because they were found not to have joined a rebellion or siege. These rewards underline a key theme. Muslim loyalty could be publicly acknowledged, not only assumed to be doubtful. These were not only years of formal campaigns and royal musters, they were dangerous years in the ordinary sense too. Bandits roamed roads, noble feuds spilled into villages, and sudden violence could hit anyone, no matter their faith. In that world, defence meant more than fighting foreign enemies. It meant responding to raids, protecting neighbours, and keeping the peace when local order broke down. Across the crown, protection worked in both directions. Lords demanded loyalty from the communities under them, but those communities also expected to be shielded from abuse. When a ruler issued a promise of safe conduct, it usually came with two messages at once. Christians were warned not to harass Muslims, and Muslims were warned not to harm Christians. Security was presented as a shared obligation, not a one-sided privilege. When alarms were raised, the expectation was collective action. If a settlement was attacked by criminals or organised raiders, people were supposed to gather quickly, armed and ready, to defend the whole area. In theory, this duty cut across social rank and religious identity. Ignoring the call could bring punishment. Yet real life was messy. Sometimes a community hesitated, not because they rejected the principle, but because fear, confusion, or local politics got in the way. A violent mob could intimidate bystanders into staying silent. In other cases, people simply did not feel motivated to risk themselves for outsiders, or for neighbours tied to unpopular debts and disputes. The risks of intervention were real. Christians who tried to protect Muslim neighbours could end up attacked themselves. There are episodes where a raiding noble seized Muslims with the intention of selling them, and rescue parties formed with both Muslim and Christian townsmen. Those rescuers were then captured as well. Moments like this show something important. When communities acted together, they were not playing out a tidy story of harmony. They were acting under pressure, making fast decisions and sometimes paying for them. Authorities often reinforced these responsibilities with broad orders. Protect this town, defend that religious house and all its dependents, keep the peace for every subject living on that land. Protection was not reserved only for minorities either. Widows, orphans and the poor were singled out as people who should not be preyed upon. The message was simple. Vulnerability itself created a claim to official defence. At the same time, mixed towns were not only places where people shared danger, they were also places where administration itself could overlap. Legal theory and church ideals sometimes insisted that non-Christians should be kept at the margins of public authority. Some civic customs even staged hierarchy in public space, showing who sat where, who spoke first, and who held formal office. But practice could be more flexible than the rules suggest. In local disputes, we often see Muslims acting as representatives of their wider town community, speaking for councils that included Christians and Muslims together. In many cases, religious labels disappear entirely in these settings, as if faith was not the point. The point was membership in a place and responsibility to that place. This local identity mattered especially in conflicts between neighbouring communities. When boundaries, pasture rights, and access to water were disputed, villages could line up against villages regardless of religion. We see Christians and Muslims from one town pressing a case together, even when the opposing party included Muslims from elsewhere. Municipal loyalty could outweigh religious solidarity when land and survival were on the line. Water and irrigation disputes reveal another layer. In regions shaped by canals and carefully managed flows, practical knowledge carried authority. Long after conquest and settlement, elder testimony was still sought to confirm boundaries and customary rights. In these investigations, Muslims could be treated as trusted local experts alongside Christians, not because everyone suddenly agreed on culture or belief, but because experience with land and water was power in itself. Shared responsibility could also have a darker consequence. Cooperation across faith lines did not only happen in defence, it also happened in wrongdoing. There are cases where Christians and Muslims act together against a third community, such as attacks on Jewish property during times of heightened tension. There are also cases where they collaborate against Christians, even targeting clergy, using kidnapping or intimidation for leverage. Sometimes local officials appear in these stories as well, which reminds us that crime and authority could blur in a world of rivalries and weak enforcement. Widows appear repeatedly as targets in these conflicts, especially when property was in question. After a husband's death, claims, rumours and alleged debts could be used to pressure the surviving family. Groups could coerce a widow into handing over money or seize land while hiding behind local influence. In these moments, the problem is not simply religious hostility. It is power, opportunity, and the vulnerability of someone left without protection. So what do we learn from all this? When interests collided, religious difference could intensify conflict, especially around taxes, obligations, and public hierarchy. But when danger arrived, or when profit tempted, the religious divide was not an unbreakable wall. People crossed it to defend neighbours, to pursue rivals, and sometimes to commit crimes together. The frontier world was not a single story of tolerance or hatred. It was a shifting landscape of fear, duty, local loyalty, and hard choices, where everyday survival often mattered more than ideology. When we look at Muslims living under Christian rule in the Ebro Valley, it is easy to imagine a simple story. A minority seen either as targets for conversion or as permanent enemies. But the reality on the ground was far more practical and far less theatrical. In the late 13th century, these communities were often treated less like a hostile force and more like a population to be governed, taxed, employed, and kept stable. Religion mattered, but it did not automatically turn every Muslim neighbour into a battlefield opponent. Even the political border between Christian and Muslim powers was not a solid wall. People crossed it constantly for trade, diplomacy, military service, family movement, and survival. And that flow softened the way religious difference was turned into everyday politics. Nothing shows this gap between ideals and reality better than the military religious orders. These groups were born from the dream of a holy war and sacred duty. Yet, in the Crown's northern river valleys, they became landlords, administrators, and economic managers. They held large estates, controlled villages, and depended heavily on Muslim labour. They attracted tenants with promises of protection and favourable terms, and they boosted their workforce by purchasing enslaved people in the markets. In practice, their daily concerns were harvests, rents, staffing, and local control. Campaigns against Muslim powers did happen, but usually as part of royal strategy, not as an independent crusading mission run by the orders themselves. And those campaigns did not necessarily poison their relationships with the Muslims who lived on their lands. A group could ride out under a banner of faith, then return home to negotiate water rights and labour duties with Muslim dependents the next week. Local conflict often reveals how little the holy war language matched real behaviour. In some towns, an order's officials were locked in bitter disputes not with Muslims, but with nearby Christian communities. Tension could build around irrigation works, property claims, arrests, or the control of a fortress. People accused each other of damage, theft, and abuse of privilege. In that climate, violence could erupt in unexpected directions. Christian townsmen might lynch a Muslim in anger, while at other times an order might be so entangled with its Muslim supporters that it treated Christian outsiders as the main threat. The point is not that ideology disappeared, but that power struggles, property, and local grudges often drove events more directly than theology did. Even in art and public imagery, Muslims were not always portrayed as monsters. In many surviving scenes, they appear as recognizable people. sometimes marked by clothing or beards, but not consistently drawn as grotesque villains. Harsh caricatures do exist, but they are rare enough to feel like exceptions rather than the standard mood of society. That matters because it suggests something important. Polemics were available, but they were not always the dominant language of daily life. Official rhetoric could still be extreme. Church voices sometimes spoke in sweeping terms about destroying enemies of the faith, and royal letters could borrow that language when it was useful. But policy often moved in a different direction. Popes could support one side in a given conflict and then protect Muslim partners in another situation. Reform-minded church leaders in Iberia frequently focused their energy on internal Christian problems like clerical discipline and heresy, rather than treating the presence of Muslims and Jews inside the realm as the central emergency of the age. What leaders said in grand declarations and what they tolerated in practice were not always the same thing. This is where the idea of the frontier needs to be handled carefully. The border with Islam was real, but it was not the only dividing line shaping the crown. The realm was full of overlapping boundaries that did not match neatly. Church jurisdictions could cut across political borders, noble estates could stretch into different kingdoms, and royal authority was not equally strong everywhere. In that sense, the frontier was not simply a line on a map. It was also any place where power was contested, where loyalties shifted, or where administration became uncertain. And beyond the peninsula, the crown's reach extended through trade and diplomacy into North Africa, with outposts, agreements, and commercial footholds that created yet another kind of border zone. Muslim life in the Ebro region was also more connected to the wider Islamic world than older stereotypes suggest. Travel continued. Trade continued. Some Muslims moved across regions inside the crown, linking communities that modern readers might imagine as sealed off. Foreign Muslim soldiers served alongside royal forces, sometimes bringing their families with them and living for long periods in Christian towns. Merchants from across the sea received safe passage to travel through the kingdom. Craftsmen and specialists moved where contracts and opportunity pulled them, and royal building projects could mix workers from distant areas into one temporary world of shared labour and shared wages. These movements mattered because they carried language, styles, habits, and news in both directions. We also see hints of wider diplomatic and social networks operating beneath official paperwork. Foreigners could be appointed to leadership roles in local Muslim communities. Envoys from Muslim courts sometimes intervened in specific cases, petitioning for pardons, permissions, or special treatment for individuals. That does not mean the system was fair or gentle. It means that the world was connected, and that influence could travel through personal relationships, service, and negotiation. Finally, migration itself remained a tool of policy. The crown did not always treat incoming Muslims as unwanted outsiders. At times, officials were ordered to protect Muslim refugees arriving from other territories, redeem them if they had been seized, and allow them to settle safely, as long as they accepted the same obligations expected from other Muslim communities under royal rule. That kind of order makes the logic clear. Stability, population, labour, and revenue often mattered more than religious purity. In the late 13th century, keeping communities productive and controlled could be more valuable than forcing them to disappear. When Muslim families moved into Christian-ruled lands, they were not simply tolerated. In many cases, they were actively recruited. Just like Christian settlers, they could be offered farmland, tax relief, and legal protections designed to make starting over possible. We see rulers and landlords treating settlement as a practical project. Populate a place, work the fields, keep irrigation running, and keep revenue flowing. Religious identity mattered, but it did not cancel out the value of productive households. New villages and neighbourhoods were expanded with mixed populations, and in some places irrigation work was planned specifically to support a set number of Christian and Muslim families living side by side. Movement inside the crown also mattered as much as immigration from outside. Muslims did not remain frozen in one town for generations. People relocated for work, safety, family connections, or better terms from a landlord. Some moved into major cities where commerce was stronger, and others shifted from rural areas to growing suburbs. That kind of mobility created friction too. Local officials sometimes tried to charge migrants special fees or treat them as if they were unfree dependents rather than ordinary taxpayers. But the very fact that Muslims argued over taxes, privileges, and legal status shows something important. They expected to be treated according to recognised rules, and they believed the system could be contested and negotiated. At first, royal authorities were rarely alarmed by Muslim relocation, as long as people stayed on lands that still fed the royal tax system. The problem was not movement itself, but the direction of movement. If Muslim households shifted onto tax-exempt noble estates, the crown lost income. Over time, some landlords also tried to block departures or demand compensation when subjects sought new protection under a different lord. These struggles reveal a deeper point. Muslims were not just a passive minority being pushed around. They were economic actors whose labour and payments were worth fighting over. If communities truly felt trapped and desperate, we would expect to see a steady stream of large-scale flight out of the realm. Instead, what appears more often is internal movement toward opportunity, which suggests that many families judge life under Christian rule as workable, sometimes even preferable to the uncertainty beyond the border. This constant travel had a social effect. It smoothed out isolation. New arrivals brought habits, language, and religious knowledge from other regions. Local Muslims could feel connected to a wider world instead of imagining themselves as stranded survivors of a lost frontier. Those networks strengthened identity, helped keep language and customs alive, and gave communities confidence. But at the same time, daily life tied Muslims to their Christian and Jewish neighbours through markets, contracts, and shared local problems. That created a second kind of belonging, not only a sense of religious community, but also a local attachment to the town, the valley, the workplace, and the people they dealt with every week. We can think of identity pulling in two directions at once: outward toward a broader religious world, and inward toward the practical homeland where life was actually lived. Trade shows this tension even more clearly. Officially, church leaders and rulers often spoke as if commerce with Muslim territories should be cut off, especially in wartime. Certain goods were treated as especially sensitive: weapons, ship materials, metals, timber, rope, and large quantities of food. Orders could read like a total barrier between two civilizations. But reality kept breaking through. The crown traded widely across the Mediterranean, and some Muslim states were too valuable as commercial partners to treat like permanent outcasts. Policy shifted with circumstance. One year the language could be harsh and absolutist. The next year the same rulers could sign agreements that protected merchants and guaranteed safe travel. Even when bans were announced, enforcing them was hard. If trade is restricted, prices rise, and higher prices invite smuggling. Merchants took risks, and authorities repeatedly caught people trying to move prohibited supplies toward enemy ports. Sometimes the accused were Christians, sometimes Muslims, because profit did not belong to one faith. At the same time, kings could quietly soften embargoes when they needed allies, or when diplomacy required it. The official story might describe a religious struggle, but the working story often followed money, ships, grain, wood, and political survival. War could also bring the frontier inside the realm. Campaigns against Muslim rebels or hostile territories forced communities in the interior to contribute taxes, supplies, and arms. That put pressure on everyone, and it could have encouraged suspicion toward local Muslims. But what stands out is how limited the backlash seems to have been in many places. Officials sometimes reminded towns that Muslims who were not fighting the crown were not to be harmed, and even praised Muslim communities for helping repair castles and defences. In practice, the state often preferred stability to panic. And because Christians and Muslims could end up serving together in local defence obligations, the habits of cooperation could weaken the temptation to treat the neighbour as an enemy. When people in medieval Iberia looked at Muslims living under Christian rule, it would be easy to assume they were automatically treated as enemies. After all, the public language of the age often framed politics as a struggle of faiths. Yet daily practice pushed in another direction, and one of the strongest reasons was simple. Muslim soldiers also fought for Christian kings. Once Muslim cavalry and raiding bands were operating inside the crown's territories, the idea that Muslim always meant enemy became harder to sustain. These mounted fighters were recruited from Islamic regions to the south and across the sea, continuing an old Iberian habit of using warriors from the other side when it was useful. Kings relied on them in wars against Christian rivals, not only in battles, but also in cross-border raiding that aimed to weaken enemies, capture supplies, and take prisoners for ransom. Over time, many of these mercenaries settled into local life with surprising ease. Some stayed as long-term residents, almost like exiles with a new base. Others lived between worlds, moving back and forth and holding ties to both their home rulers and their Christian hosts. What makes this especially striking is how normal their relationships could become with local society. We find Muslim commanders leading mixed bands that included Christians and sometimes other groups as well. They negotiated ransoms, sold captured goods, and used local intermediaries to communicate with victims and manage payments. Royal government often treated these men not as outsiders to be tolerated, but as valuable assets to be supported. Some received official pay, formal recognition, and direct access to the court. Their private matters could even attract royal attention, including help arranging marriages for members of their entourage and firm enforcement of their right to collect debts. And when business disputes inevitably appeared, the state often intervened in ways that show how seriously these relationships were taken. If a local borrower failed to repay what was owed to a Muslim fighter, royal officials could be ordered to enforce repayment. If someone cheated a Muslim mercenary, the king could step in to recover the money. That kind of protection tells us something important. These men were not treated as untouchable foreigners. They were being fitted into the machinery of the realm, at least when their service was needed. Violence between these mercenaries and locals does appear, but it is surprisingly rare in the records compared to what we might expect. When attacks happened, they often look less like religious hatred and more like opportunism. A well-armed band passing through with horses and loot was a tempting target. In such cases, royal orders to return stolen goods show that the crown wanted discipline, not chaos, because these troops were part of the king's strategy. Of course, clashes could also break out between Muslim groups themselves, reminding us that conflict was not always Christian versus Muslim. In a violent society, rivalries cut across faith lines as easily as they followed them. For ordinary people in the Ebro region, the most meaningful frontiers were often not the distant Islamic kingdoms at all. The borders that shaped life were the nearby ones: rival towns, contested grazing lands, dangerous roads, and the zones where renegade nobles or raiders struck. A distant southern kingdom mattered less than the neighbouring Christian frontier, where raids and reprisals could erupt at any moment. Even when treaties were signed, local councils could continue to raid across borders because local rivalries and habits of violence did not simply disappear when kings shook hands. This is why frontier life often pushed Muslims and Christians into the same boat. They could collaborate in raids against rival towns, join legal action together, or simply endure the same pressures from aggressive lords and unstable politics. For many communities, harvests, taxes, and security mattered as much as any grand religious narrative. Chroniclers could mention a military capture and a plague of locusts in the same breath, because both threatened survival in equal measure. All of this exposes a gap between ideals and reality. Official calls to fight enemies of the faith existed, but so did warm and respectful royal letters to Muslim allies. The church could speak in absolute terms, yet church institutions also benefited from trade and stability, and often preferred workable arrangements over permanent confrontation. Kings valued local Muslim taxpayers and farmers, and they valued foreign Muslim fighters when Christian wars demanded them. That combination limited the space for openly vindictive policy. Muslims could still face casual exclusion and social ranking, but in this period we do not see a consistent state-driven campaign of persecution aimed at them simply for being Muslim. To understand everyday life, we also have to look beyond warfare and policy into the texture of towns and villages. Muslims and Christians lived close together in a physically mixed environment. Fields were interwoven, houses and shops sat side by side. The built landscape was not cleanly separated by faith. Documents show properties bordered by owners from different religions, creating constant contact in routine matters like fences, water rights, rents and repairs. Public spaces multiplied that contact. People met at mills, ovens, inns, baths and markets. Travellers slept under the same roofs. Shoppers bought goods without turning every transaction into a religious statement. In a marketplace, the urgent question was often price and quality, not the seller's faith. A loaf of bread, a tool, a rope, or a sack of grain could pass between hands with little tension, because the exchange carried no obvious religious symbolism for most buyers. But the deeper we move into organised institutions, the more complicated interaction became. Trade associations, civic meetings, and formal guild life often carried Christian ceremonial elements. That is where hierarchy and public ritual mattered. In such settings, communities tended to develop patterns that signalled rank and difference, not necessarily because neighbours hated each other, but because public order was expected to display who stood above whom. These gestures could be interpreted as routine choreography of status. Yet when taxes rose, or when hardship sharpened resentment, the same choreography could easily become humiliation. Festivals show another layer. Many celebrations had both religious meaning and social attraction, and it was common for people to be curious about each other's gatherings. That curiosity worried religious leaders. Church councils repeatedly tried to block intimate household-level mixing, especially domestic service, childcare and shared living arrangements, because they feared social closeness would weaken boundaries. Similar anxieties existed in Muslim societies too, where legal scholars often warned against adopting the customs of other faiths. These rules reveal something crucial. Lawmakers do not keep banning behaviours that never happen. The very existence of repeated prohibitions suggests that daily life created plenty of interaction, and that strict separation was difficult to enforce. Across the medieval Mediterranean, clothing was never just fashion. It was a language of power, status, and belonging. Many societies used dress rules to mark who someone was allowed to be in public. In parts of the Islamic world, minorities were sometimes expected to dress in ways that made them immediately recognizable. In Christian Europe, the habit of regulating appearance had deep roots too, because rulers and elites long used clothing to separate nobles from commoners and to signal rank inside the upper classes. Over time, these two traditions overlapped, and Christian authorities increasingly tried to apply visual labels to religious minorities as well. Church law pushed in that direction by insisting that Jews and Muslims should be distinguishable from Christians at a glance. The stated goal was to prevent confusion, and above all to prevent sexual mixing across faith lines. But when we look at the Crown's lands in the 13th century, we do not see these rules applied evenly or consistently. Some church leaders ignored broader directives for years, and even when attention finally turned to dress and visibility, enforcement focused far more heavily on Jews than on Muslims. In many early rulings, Muslims are barely mentioned, which tells us that priorities were shaped as much by local anxieties as by grand legal programs. When royal government did speak about minority clothing, the language often returned to the same fear: the claim that visible difference would prevent scandal, especially relationships between minority men and Christian women. Some local regulations also targeted hairstyles as a marker. Yet the silence of records about punishments or violations suggests a simple reality. these measures were often more talk than practice in this era. In some places, the rules existed on paper, but they were not policed with real energy until later, when authorities began to treat visibility as a more serious tool of control. It's also worth remembering that external markers are not always imposed from above. Communities sometimes keep their own visual customs to strengthen group identity and internal cohesion. A distinctive belt, a tattoo, or a particular way of dressing can serve as protection as much as stigma. The same double meaning appears in neighbourhood patterns as well. Creating a concentrated district can be seen as exclusion, but it can also be a deliberate choice for safety, solidarity, and the preservation of religious life. That tension shows up clearly when we follow Muslim communities requesting permission to build new residential quarters. In one town, Muslims asked for the right to establish a concentrated neighbourhood along the inside of the city wall. The Crown allowed it, and the new district was not only a place to build houses, it came with unusually strong local legal autonomy, including authority over disputes involving Christians, Jews, and even enslaved people tied to the town. On the same day, leading Muslim officials purchased valuable property there. Those legal privileges made the area more attractive to Muslim residents and raised the value of what these officials had bought. That detail reminds us that policy and profit often move together. Local Christian authorities did not always welcome this kind of arrangement. Municipal government could see the new district as a loss of jurisdiction and revenue. Predictably, friction followed. Muslim residents complained that the town council interfered with construction and settlement, and the dispute dragged on for years. In the end, royal power reaffirmed the district's autonomy and ordered local officials to back off in specific lawsuits. The message was clear. The Crown wanted the rules it had granted to stand, even when local politics tried to undo them. Still, we should not imagine the Ebro region in the 13th century as a landscape of strict separation. Muslim quarters existed, but they were not always sealed off, and Muslims were not necessarily confined to them. Property records show mixed patterns, with Christians living near Muslim households and buying or inheriting houses alongside Muslim neighbours. In some cases, Christians even moved into Muslim quarters. When later rulers tried to stop that kind of building, the motive may not have been social segregation at all. It could just as easily have been financial administration. A clearly defined minority district was easier to tax and manage, and it reduced the risk that property would slip into categories protected from royal taxation. It is in the early 14th century that the tone begins to harden. We find orders demanding that Muslims stop living scattered among Christians and instead move into a defined district. Officials are told to select an area, relocate Muslim households there, and ensure they build separately. Compensation was sometimes promised through the sale of the homes Muslims were forced to leave, but that kind of remedy was limited comfort. What is striking is the language of surprise, as if mixed residence were abnormal, even though it had been common and lawful for a long time. When we dig into local context, we often see that these pushes for segregation were not random. They could be driven by influential individuals close to the court, and by local conflicts over money, authority, and church claims. In one small community, earlier disputes centred on tithes and exemptions, and the Muslims had repeatedly appealed to the Crown for protection against pressure from local institutions. In that setting, a later relocation order looks less like a sudden moral awakening and more like the outcome of a long-running tension between a small Muslim group and church-linked power. Even with new districts and new visibility rules, social mixing did not disappear. Documents from the following century show Christians and Muslims still working together, drinking in the same places, gambling, and sharing the same urban temptations to the annoyance of religious officials. Royal government often cared less about everyday mingling than about protecting its rights, especially the right to tax, regulate taverns, and control where minority customers spent money. Names tell a similar story. Many Muslims moved comfortably through Christian society. Some used romance-style nicknames or occupational labels, and some carried names that looked fully Christian unless a notary explicitly identified them as Muslim. Clothing and speech could also blend into the surrounding culture. In towns and villages where daily life was thoroughly mixed, that similarity made the fears of moral panic easier to imagine for anxious clerics. When people look alike, live near each other, and share public spaces, the lines that rulers try to draw on parchment rarely hold as firmly on the street. From the viewpoint of medieval religious authorities, everyday mixing between faiths was never neutral. Social contact was often treated as a slippery slope, and sexual contact was seen as the ultimate danger, a direct threat to religious boundaries and to the moral order they believed God had fixed in place. That is why rules against interfaith sex and marriage show up again and again across the Mediterranean world. Jewish and Islamic legal traditions both warned against relationships outside the community, especially when children might be born from them, because family life was where identity was reproduced and passed on. Even so, these traditions did not all draw the lines in the same way. In Islamic law, the harshest restrictions fell on women, while Muslim men could marry women from Christian or Jewish backgrounds under certain conditions. Those wives could keep their religion, but the children were expected to belong to the father's faith. Jewish communities, meanwhile, tended to treat interfaith sex with far greater alarm, especially where women were involved, because Jewish identity was tied closely to the mother. Many Jewish thinkers also urged men to avoid such relationships, fearing social breakdown and the loss of communal continuity. Inside the crown's Christian-ruled lands, the official stance was uncompromising. Minority men were forbidden to have sexual relations with Christian women, and the penalties could be extreme. What may surprise us is that authorities also worried about Christian men and free Muslim women, not only about the reverse. Records show Muslim women being detained after accusations of these relationships, and in some cases we glimpse a darker reality behind the charge: coercion, silence, and fear. A woman could be blamed even if she had been assaulted, and families might avoid reporting violence because the consequences could ruin the victim's life. When convictions happened, punishments could be brutal, including enslavement for Muslim women found guilty. That kind of sentence also reveals the colonial imbalance of the system. It turned sex into a tool that could destroy a person's freedom as well as their reputation. At the same time, the law did not always treat men as untouchable. Even Christian men could be pulled into court when accused of relations with Muslim women, which tells us these boundaries were policed in multiple directions. Still, one category sat outside the normal rules: enslaved women. Across Christian, Muslim, and Jewish societies, male owners commonly took enslaved women as sexual partners, and this was widely tolerated, even when everyone understood how unequal and coercive it usually was. Legal codes discuss the status of these women and their children in surprisingly practical detail, because the issue was frequent enough to demand rules. Children might be described as free in principle, yet tied to the social reality of slavery in ways that could be contested. Whatever sentimental stories could sometimes emerge, most of these relationships were not romances. They were power speaking through the body. During much of the 13th century, the Crown's laws against interfaith sex were severe on paper. Earlier on, enforcement may have been looser, but over time punishments were laid down with frightening clarity. In some towns, both partners could be executed, sometimes by burning. Other places prescribed public, violent deaths for minority men accused of relations with Christian women, while the women faced burning as well. Yet even these harsh codes included escape clauses. If the woman had been forced, if she had been deceived, or if the man had disguised himself as a Christian, the woman might be spared. The goal was not just to prevent mixed families, it was to defend a vision of hierarchy and sacred order, and it is important to remember that ordinary Christian adultery could also be punished harshly. These were societies where sex, honour and public discipline were tightly bound together, but the distance between law and life was often wide. When cases did reach royal justice, what stands out is how often the outcome was not execution, but pardon, especially when fines were paid. In practice, many sexual offences were treated like other crimes that could be settled through royal penalties and payments. The people most likely to appear in the surviving records are often those with status, connections, or proximity to power, including officials and families tied to local leadership. They were the ones most able to push a case upward, defend themselves, or negotiate outcomes. Occasionally, a case breaks through the pattern and shows the system at its hardest. We hear of a Muslim man executed for relations with a Christian woman in circumstances described as violent. That detail matters because it suggests assault rather than a consensual relationship. It also reminds us that local culture mattered. Some places carried a reputation for being especially harsh toward minority communities, and what might be ignored or settled elsewhere could become deadly there. Still, given how intertwined daily life could be, the small number of recorded cases is striking. It hints that much was hidden, quietly managed, or never reported. Marriage across faith lines was another matter entirely. The Church did not recognise interfaith marriage unless one partner converted to Christianity. Yet we can reasonably assume that discrete relationships existed in the shadows, especially in a world of markets, shared streets, and constant contact. Sometimes the sources hint at dramatic stories. A Christian girl taken away by Muslims, later joining their faith and marrying into their community. Whether such episodes were love, coercion, or something in between is often impossible to prove from the documents alone, but they show that the boundaries were not only legal lines, they were lived realities that people sometimes crossed. In most cases, however, the main space where sex crossed religious lines was prostitution. Prostitution was widespread, and minority women appear often in the records because authorities taxed and regulated them. In some cities, Muslim sex workers were treated almost as a recognised category of revenue. Licenses, poll taxes, and yearly payments appear in financial documents. That paper trail reveals something blunt and uncomfortable. Institutions that presented themselves as defenders of the faith could still profit from a sex economy that involved minority women and Christian clients. The state itself, even more than religious orders, was tied to this system through taxation. Jewish sex workers also appear in the sources, and when elites complained, the concern often had less to do with morality and more to do with neighbourhood order and personal inconvenience. This is another reminder that religious policy was not always driven by purity. It was often driven by money, reputation, and control of urban space. Because of the strict rules, Christian men had far more freedom to seek partners across communal lines, while Muslim and Jewish men had to act with greater caution. That imbalance shapes what becomes visible in the record. It may be tempting to read symbolic motives into Christian attraction to Muslim women, but the simpler explanation is enough: supply, demand, poverty, and limited options for women on the margins. There is no clear proof that interfaith prostitution in the 13th century Ebro was systematically used as a weapon of humiliation or conquest. The documents show exploitation and inequality, but they do not prove an organised strategy of sexual violence. What they do show is how easily moral panic and fiscal interest could coexist in the same system. From the viewpoint of medieval religious authorities, everyday mixing between faiths was never neutral. Social contact was often treated as a slippery slope, and sexual contact was seen as the ultimate danger, a direct threat to religious boundaries and to the moral order they believed God had fixed in place. That is why rules against interfaith sex and marriage show up again and again across the Mediterranean world. Jewish and Islamic legal traditions both warned against relationships outside the community, especially when children might be born from them, because family life was where identity was reproduced and passed on. Even so, these traditions did not all draw the lines in the same way. In Islamic law, the harshest restrictions fell on women. while Muslim men could marry women from Christian or Jewish backgrounds under certain conditions. Those wives could keep their religion, but the children were expected to belong to the father's faith. Jewish communities, meanwhile, tended to treat interfaith sex with far greater alarm, especially where women were involved, because Jewish identity was tied closely to the mother. Many Jewish thinkers also urged men to avoid such relationships, fearing social breakdown and the loss of communal continuity. Inside the crown's Christian-ruled lands, the official stance was uncompromising. Minority men were forbidden to have sexual relations with Christian women, and the penalties could be extreme. What may surprise us is that authorities also worried about Christian men and free Muslim women, not only about the reverse. Records show Muslim women being detained after accusations of these relationships, and in some cases we glimpse a darker reality behind the charge: coercion, silence, and fear. A woman could be blamed even if she had been assaulted, and families might avoid reporting violence because the consequences could ruin the victim's life. When convictions happened, punishments could be brutal, including enslavement for Muslim women found guilty. That kind of sentence also reveals the colonial imbalance of the system. It turned sex into a tool that could destroy a person's freedom as well as their reputation. At the same time, the law did not always treat men as untouchable. Even Christian men could be pulled into court when accused of relations with Muslim women, which tells us these boundaries were policed in multiple directions. Still, one category sat outside the normal rules: enslaved women. Across Christian, Muslim, and Jewish societies, male owners commonly took enslaved women as sexual partners, and this was widely tolerated, even when everyone understood how unequal and coercive it usually was. Legal codes discussed the status of these women and their children in surprisingly practical detail, because the issue was frequent enough to demand rules. Children might be described as free in principle, yet tied to the social reality of slavery in ways that could be contested. Whatever sentimental stories could sometimes emerge, most of these relationships were not romances. They were power speaking through the body. During much of the 13th century, the Crown's laws against interfaith sex were severe on paper. Earlier on, enforcement may have been looser, but over time, punishments were laid down with frightening clarity. In some towns, both partners could be executed, sometimes by burning. Other places prescribed public, violent deaths for minority men accused of relations with Christian women, while the women faced burning as well. Yet even these harsh codes included escape clauses. If the woman had been forced, if she'd been deceived, or if the man had disguised himself as a Christian, the woman might be spared. The goal was not just to prevent mixed families, it was to defend a vision of hierarchy and sacred order. And it is important to remember that ordinary Christian adultery could also be punished harshly. These were societies where sex, honour, and public discipline were tightly bound together. But the distance between law and life was often wide. When cases did reach royal justice, what stands out is how often the outcome was not execution, but pardon, especially when fines were paid. In practice, many sexual offences were treated like other crimes that could be settled through royal penalties and payments. The people most likely to appear in the surviving records are often those with status, connections, or proximity to power, including officials and families tied to local leadership. They were the ones most able to push a case upward, defend themselves, or negotiate outcomes. Occasionally, a case breaks through the pattern and shows the system at its hardest. We hear of a Muslim man executed for relations with a Christian woman in circumstances described as violent. That detail matters because it suggests assault rather than a consensual relationship. It also reminds us that local culture mattered. Some places carried a reputation for being especially harsh toward minority communities, and what might be ignored or settled elsewhere could become deadly there. Still, given how intertwined daily life could be, the small number of recorded cases is striking. It hints that much was hidden, quietly managed, or never reported. Marriage across faith lines was another matter entirely. The church did not recognise interfaith marriage unless one partner converted to Christianity. Yet we can reasonably assume that discrete relationships existed in the shadows, especially in a world of markets, shared streets, and constant contact. Sometimes the sources hint at dramatic stories. A Christian girl taken away by Muslims, later joining their faith and marrying into their community. Whether such episodes were love, coercion, or something in between is often impossible to prove from the documents alone, but they show that the boundaries were not only legal lines, they were lived realities that people sometimes crossed. In most cases, however, the main space where sex crossed religious lines was prostitution. Prostitution was widespread, and minority women appear often in the records because authorities taxed and regulated them. In some cities, Muslim sex workers were treated almost as a recognised category of revenue. Licenses, poll taxes, and yearly payments appear in financial documents. That paper trail reveals something blunt and uncomfortable. Institutions that presented themselves as defenders of the faith could still profit from a sex economy that involved minority women and Christian clients. The state itself, even more than religious orders, was tied to this system through taxation. Jewish sex workers also appear in the sources, and when elites complained, the concern often had less to do with morality and more to do with neighbourhood order and personal inconvenience. This is another reminder that religious policy was not always driven by purity. It was often driven by money, reputation, and control of urban space. Because of the strict rules, Christian men had far more freedom to seek partners across communal lines, while Muslim and Jewish men had to act with greater caution. That imbalance shapes what becomes visible in the record. It may be tempting to read symbolic motives into Christian attraction to Muslim women, but the simpler explanation is enough: supply, demand, poverty, and limited options for women on the margins. There is no clear proof that interfaith prostitution in the 13th century Ebro was systematically used as a weapon of humiliation or conquest. The documents show exploitation and inequality, but they do not prove an organised strategy of sexual violence. What they do show is how easily moral panic and fiscal interest could coexist in the same system. When we talk about violence in the Crown of Aragon during the 13th century, we have to start with one basic point. Brutality was not an exception, it was part of the landscape. The realm was multi-ethnic and multi-faith, and that diversity shaped daily life, but it did not automatically explain every attack, every raid, or every murder. If we want to understand what happened to Muslim communities, we have to separate two things that are often mixed together: violence aimed at people because they were Muslim, and violence driven by the wider climate of disorder, feuds, banditry, and noble power politics. Because this was a hard world, violence could even become a strange bridge between communities. We find cases where Christians and Muslims worked together in violent crime, breaking laws side by side, sharing risk and profit. Mixed gangs appear in the record: jailbreaks, raids, killings carried out by groups that included members of different faiths. In some towns, monks and church officials complained that locals attacked their property and wounded their men, and these locals could include both Christians and Muslims living under the same lord. In situations like that, the motive was often not religion at all, but resistance to taxes, resentment toward landlords, or anger at ecclesiastical demands. Sometimes the violence was openly criminal. Sometimes it was social conflict taking physical form. Muslims were also capable of acting alone. We see references to Muslim bandits, long active enough to build reputations, blamed for murder, robbery, and repeated attacks. Just as importantly, Muslims did not always appear as helpless victims in the legal system. When Muslims were accused of serious crimes, they could insist on proper procedure, demand the court they were entitled to, and send agents to higher authorities when local officials tried to rush judgment. That tells us something crucial. These communities understood the rules and could fight back through the law even when the playing field was not equal. Still, many surviving documents describe Muslims being attacked, abducted, or used as bargaining chips in conflicts. That has encouraged a picture of constant targeted oppression, but the context often points elsewhere. In many incidents, Muslims were harmed not because they were Muslims, but because they belonged to a lord who was fighting another lord, or because they lived on lands caught in an inter-Christian feud. In those struggles, Muslim tenants could be seized as leverage, livestock could be stolen, and people could be carried off to pressure rival powers. It was a grim reminder that peasants and tenants, whatever their religion, were often treated like property in elite quarrels, and we have to widen the lens even further. The Crown in this period struggled with endemic lawlessness, raids between neighbouring towns, armed gangs on the roads, and noble violence that bordered on private war show up constantly. Villages complained about attacks by magnates, church houses were robbed and assaulted, travellers were ambushed on public highways, herds were rustled in the hundreds, people were taken hostage for ransom. Royal letters sometimes read like angry attempts to restore basic order, because the king's officials were failing to keep the peace. In some places, tougher local judges did hunt down highwaymen, but the larger pattern remained. Violence was everywhere, and it did not stop at religious boundaries. This helps explain why both Muslim and Christian communities could receive relief after suffering raids. Taxes might be reduced because a village had been devastated. Complaints came from monasteries, towns, and rural districts alike. Religion mattered in law and identity, but robbery did not always care. A bandit could prey on Christians, Jews, and Muslims without discrimination. A noble might seize animals wherever they were easiest to seize. And because powerful people could bargain for pardons or simply escape serious punishment, violence could become routine. That said, truly explicit anti-Muslim violence does appear, but it is rarer than we might expect. There were moments when Muslim neighbourhoods were attacked and people were killed, yet even in those cases the deeper cause can be hard to pin down. A religious explanation is possible, but so is a political one. Anger aimed at military order, resentment over taxes, pressure points in local power struggles. In other words, religion could be the language used to justify an attack, while the engine beneath it might be something else. If we want to see where anti-Muslim hostility becomes clearer, it is often in the quieter forms of aggression. Cemeteries were desecrated, sacred spaces were damaged, burial grounds were used disrespectfully, sometimes even turned into spaces for vice or construction, in ways that pushed communities to the edge. These acts were not always direct assaults on bodies, but they struck at dignity, memory, and community identity. They signalled contempt, and they could be used as pressure to make people leave. At the same time, abuses could also be bureaucratic and coercive, forcing Muslim communities into extra labour, ignoring their protections, treating them as a convenient pool of unpaid service. Religious tension also flared during emotionally charged public moments, especially festivals and major ceremonies. Public celebrations strengthened Christian identity, and in that heightened atmosphere, minorities could become targets for mockery, harassment, or scapegoating. But even then, we have to be careful. Crowds behave differently in ritual and festival time than they do on an ordinary workday. An ugly incident in a procession does not automatically mean the same level of hostility shaped everyday neighbourly life. So the picture we end up with is complicated but clearer. These were violent decades. People lived with banditry, feuding, and noble aggression as a constant threat. Muslims and Jews did face disadvantages under Christian rule, and religious identity could be used against them, especially when it was useful to someone with power. But they were not powerless outsiders. Royal protection mattered. Their economic value mattered. Their ability to use courts and networks mattered. They could be victims, but they could also be actors, partners, litigants, and sometimes perpetrators. And that is the key. In the Crown of Aragon, violence was not a single story of one community attacking another. It was a shared environment of danger, where religion sometimes shaped the target, sometimes shaped the excuse, and sometimes mattered far less than money, local rivalries, and the simple opportunity to take what could be taken.